You see, in every one of these long go-to-sleep videos, I remind people to use the download feature on YouTube Premium to watch these videos offline anyway, because these videos are perfect for listening to while on an airplane, where you don't have internet usually, doing chores, or if your internet just goes out and you have nothing to do, you'll still be able to at least watch this video. And there's no need to use up data or extra battery life on your phone when you can just download the video and have it around for you when you need it. And the best part is, of course, no ads. And not only that, but YouTube gives a cut to everyone who watches your videos with Premium. So you're supporting them way more than watching ads anyway. If you use my link in the video description, you get 2 free months of Premium to try out, and YouTube compensates me when Premium members watch my videos. Now let's get on to the video. In this video, we're going to be discussing the worst zones to level in, taking into account Classic and Retail era. And at number 10, we have the 1,000 Needles. A lot of the quests in this zone are basically fetch quests that the player might see while in low-level zones, like killing wildlife until the player gets an item drop, or running to the other side of the map to collect things. Along with the drop chances being low, as all drop chances in vanilla were, it was possible for the player to grind the same mobs for quite a long time and get no drops at all, as the drop rates were around 10 to 25% a mob. On some quests, certain mobs only spawned in 2 locations, making players fight over who got to get the mob. On top of all this, there weren't that many quests to do in the zone, and the layout of the area, having to climb the mountains to obtain or even turn in quests, made it a pain to navigate. There were some cool quests though, like killing some of the Grim Totem on top of a mountain, but no other quest really stands out from the rest. The revamp in Cataclysm did not help the zone very much, as adding water to the zone did change the way it played, even giving you a special boat mount for use there, but the entirety could be skipped by just taking a boat to the questing hub. The already notorious underwater questing and combat made it even more unfun than its vanilla counterpart, and it's a wonder why this zone was avoided by most of the player base. And at number 9, we have Gorgrond. This is a zone in Draenor and was the second zone players were sent to after finishing Frostfire Ridge for Horde or Shadowwind Valley for Alliance. Compared to the other Warlord zones, Gorgrond offered nothing noteworthy questing-wise. It didn't have important lore like the previous zones did, or at least lore that wasn't ever expanded upon and just forgotten, and most of the quests were fairly generic and enemies that weren't all that interesting. In Warlords of Draenor, they added this new bonus objective system that has quest tasks, like destroying a number of eggs or killing a certain number of Iron Horde, and your reward was a massive amount of experience, and was really the only reason why a lot of players went here. These bonus tasks were convoluted and tedious to other zones' counterparts, but at least they let you skip the zone faster with all the XP they gave. Along with being a very long zone that took a few minutes to traverse, although it could be made a bit better with the Goblin Shredder Garrison campaign upgrade. A number of things were cut from Lords of Draenor, and Gorgrond seems to have taken the worst of it. For example, the train tracks spanning the zone, which Blizzard originally intended for a train to move through the area as a way for players to get around since flying was not going to be added, even referenced in the Grimrail Depot dungeon, or an entire section of Laughing Skull orcs placed on the edge of the map that acted as nothing more than a resting spot, or the 2 giants fighting that we never saw a conclusion to. Although the reasons that make it not as good as a traditional leveling zone worked in its favor as a speed leveling zone in later expansions. Because there were so many bonus objectives and compared to the other zones, it was a priority zone to hit to level quicker in a lot of expansions that cheesed leveling with XP potions, where what they would do was go around to all of the bonus objectives, complete them until they only had 1 task left to do, then pop the Elixir of the Rapid Mind potion and complete them all as fast as possible. This potion gave you a super high 300% extra experience buff, but it only had a short 15-minute duration, which made it perfect to combo with Gorgrond, and could be enough experience to skip WoD leveling altogether if you added in gathering some treasures afterwards. This combo no longer works as they removed the potion from the game and nerfed XP gains from Warlords of Draenor content across the board. So Gorgrond is back to low tier status once again. And at number 8, we have the Swamp of Sorrows. The reason why this is on this list is for a few notable reasons. The way to get the quest here was somewhat confusing, as once you completed all the quests given in Stonard, the rest were hidden within other encampments, along with no real noteworthy quests, and the zone being difficult to navigate due to level 60 elite dragons flying around, who were able to dismount and kill players within just a few hits. Getting killed resulted in a very long corpse walk time, as like most of vanilla, there was few graveyards, but with the zone being so long, it meant really long death runs, Another part being the massive amounts of rivers within the zone, all of them deep enough to force you to dismount. And also all full of crocodiles, not only dismounting you, but also putting you in combat. Although even then, the worst part of the area was Sunken Temple, a dungeon located near the east of the zone found within a large lake. The problem with this though was trying to get inside the temple was a challenge in itself. Blizzard designed the temple to be more of a maze for players to go through rather than a straight instance run, with groups of players having to do almost a miniature dungeon just to get inside the real one, fighting elite trolls the entire way. There was also a quest which required the player to collect 20 fetish of Hakars and 10 Atalite tablets, which were out of the way and made players go to the other section of the temple to collect, dragged on an already long dungeon crawl into an even longer one, and none of this was even inside the actual dungeon. The inside of the dungeon itself was one of the most annoying, complicated, and exhausting dungeons they ever made. Check out our video on the longest dungeons for more info on that. True to its name, this really is the Swamp of Sorrows, as the zone had a lot of potential to be its own unique area, but unfortunately fell flat as with many other vanilla zones. With its rework in Cataclysm, it got changed a fair bit. While the left half of it only got minor changes, the entire right half got reworked, with far fewer rivers, a few extra towns, and the once lake now directly connected to the ocean in a giant opening for use as a port. Even adding a huge alliance town and an outpost, which is quite funny as before the update, the zone had no major hub for alliance. Also, fun fact, a massive chunk of the storyline was dealing with the Draenei, which originally looked like horrible little gremlin creatures. That is until the Burning Crusade was released and they were changed to the Lost One's broken Draenei who escaped Azeroth and became disgusting creatures. Much less appealing than the space goats we came to know and love in the Exodar. And at number 7, we have Azshara. Before the Cataclysm revamp, Azshara was a unique zone, seeing as nothing really happened here. It was full of far more dangerous elites than the other zones were, and there were very few quests to do. Zones of Vanilla had different quest numbers depending on if the player was Horde or Alliance, and since Azshara was closer to Horde, if an Alliance player went there was practically nothing for them to do, even less than normal in these kinds of situations. It was a huge and open zone that was unwelcoming to those who decided to venture here, especially as it only had one flight path being on the very far left of the zone, away from literally everything. They might have possibly had other intentions for the zone, but whatever it was, it obviously was not realized. Seeing as many other zones of vanilla were also lackluster or possibly had very little, such as Silithus for example, it's easy to see they kind of ran out of time with some of them. Azshara was an area that was only really used to do various max level quests, like the entire Molten Core Hydraxian Waterlord questline required to summon Ragnaros, and also used to summon Maz, a giant shark killed to rebuild the Scepter of the Shifting Sands during the opening of Ahn'Qiraj. This zone isn't bad as part of the world per se, but there's just practically no quest or anything interesting here until max level that would allure the player to traveling all the way there. The Cataclysm revamp changed this area quite a lot. For example, the Bilgewater Cartel's goblins have taken over the zone as their new base of operations, changing it from a max level questing area to quite a low level location, and with this added tons of new quests, making it an actual good leveling location. To commemorate their new partnership with the Horde, the Bilgewater Goblins carved the landscape into a giant symbol of the Horde, so that anyone who looked upon the map would see the very sigil of the Horde in the land itself above the faction's major city. This transformational landscape was a complete overhaul of the entire zone. Many goblin bases, mines, a rocket roller coaster traveling system, and a giant Gallywix head sitting beside the Pleasure Palace. This zone was changed from a land of ancient ruins untouched by mortal hands into a capitalist wonderland of exploiting the landscape to Party Peninsula. Its Cataclysm version is much better, and it's basically on this list for its pre-Cata iteration. And at number 6, we have Blade's Edge Mountain. This zone is widely regarded in the Burning Crusade community as being the worst possible area to level in for multiple reasons, such as generic and uninteresting quests like Go Kill 30 Ogres, a horrible layout of the area, multiple levels, cliffs, areas separated by long caves full of mobs, and long run-back times as the player died. In the Burning Crusade, when reaching level 68, the player had the opportunity to purchase flying. This was nearly required for some sections of high-level zones, like Netherstorm, Shadowmoon Valley, and of course, Blade's Edge Mountain. Blade's Edge was especially annoying though, as even with flying, all of these areas were separated by massive cliff sides covered in spikes. That meant to get even a short distance in some locations, you had to fly all the way up a cliffside and then down on the other side. On top of this, there were really no standout quests in the zone either. All this was made even worse with the Ogrelaw rep being within the zone, one of the most annoying reps of all time to farm, with slow Simon Says and annoying long dailies that gave very little rep. And it didn't even give a mount like many of the other TBC reps did. The only good thing about this area was the endgame quest lines around and leading to Gruul's lair. And at number 5, we have Desolace. This was a zone in Kalimdor that was, well, desolate, at least until Cataclysm. The quest sent players across the map to collect items and do the same trivial content that most zones offered, except with no real story outside of a remnant of the Legion and some Centaur rivalries. Most of the quest lines, even the ones involving the Centaur tribe, were fairly boring or held no real lore importance, other than having a niche system where you got factions, which gave quests based on which Centaur tribe you killed, which led to literally nothing rep-wise. Visually speaking, it was all the same color of gray and had the infamous Bone Collector quest. This quest would require the player to go around and collect Kodo bones. The annoying part of this was that sometimes when interacting with these bones, a Kodo apparition would spawn at level 39 and hit very hard, killing most players in the process, as this zone was meant for players who had just turned level 30. This quest itself being available at level 33, but recommended for players of 37, which even then was low. Desolace was filled with quests that required players to go to the other side of the map and kill some centaurs, then travel all the way back, receive a similar quest to the one they just did, then travel all the way back to the same spot and do it again. This zone was very similar to most other vanilla zones in which it required the player to constantly go from A to B, then back to A again, and do meaningless things. However, with just how boring the quests were, the lack of any real story, and the zone itself looking bland, it made this experience far worse than most. This zone, like most, did get revamped during the Cataclysm expansion. It made Desolace not as desolate. Deathwing shattering collapsed cliff sides and crumbled mountains, causing some zones, like the Thousand Needles and Durotar, to be flooded with water. However, Desolace was luckily spared, as it connected directly to the ocean, the land cracking apart causing the rivers of ocean water to find their way through the zone, bringing more life to the area with the help of the druids of the Cenarian Circle, along with some other changes, like the Centaur clans being wiped out and the Naga taking over more of the coastline, as the coastline itself extended further into the land. And at number 4, we have the Arathi Highlands. In Classic, after around level 20 to 25, Blizzard didn't have a direction for players to really go to level up, seeing as Vanilla wasn't finished when it was launched, and because of this, it left the player to find their own path around the world with very little sense of direction. Arathi Highlands was looking like a good spot as it's right next to the wetlands, but Arathi Highlands was an unbalanced mess. The zone contained mobs far out-leveling that of the player, which roamed around the spots that players needed to quest in. Before the release of Burning Crusade, Stromgarde was full of elite fleeing humanoids, warlocks with pets, and invisible rogues, making questing there for low levels nearly impossible. Along with the minefield of mobs being clumped together, pulling more than one at a time was almost a certain death sentence, as per vanilla leveling zones. And with the caves the players was constantly sent to that were filled with ogres and kobolds, dying was going to happen unless you took extreme caution. Having long run-back times was per usual, seeing as there was only one graveyard. The area was rich in mining nodes, and because of this, it was a popular spot to gather minerals for leveling, crafting, and selling. But with the density of mobs, the elites roaming around the area, and the overall lack of quests that Arathi Highlands offered, this zone made levelers miserable and was only used to get to the other zones. The revamp in Cataclysm didn't change much in this zone either, besides a new Forsaken camp next to Thoradin's Wall, some new NPCs scattered around the area, and some small visual changes. The only other change worth noting was a tunnel that allowed players to be able to travel to the hinterlands, although it did get an overhaul in BFA when it became a warfront, and even being filled with various rares and world quests. It was most likely chosen because no one really cared much if the zone was revamped again. And at number 3, we have Vashj'ir. This zone is probably expected on this list, seeing as underwater combat is not Blizzard's strong suit. You see, Vashj'ir was a beta of sorts for Blizzard testing an underwater expansion, and eventually an underwater raid. This, however, didn't go over well with the community, and just left a sour taste for almost everyone who quested in the zone. Underwater and even air combat doesn't work well with WoW's combat systems. Examples being abilities like Charge just won't work sometimes, and other times will just send you rocketing to the ground below you, then forward a little bit, then rocketing back up to your target. And of course, AoE location abilities not being able to work in 3D spaces. There's a reason WoW is really designed around being a 2D game, and it's rare we ever fight things in the third dimension of up or down. And when we do, it's usually very annoying. Along with trained underwater combat, the zone was filled with quests that had far travel distances to collect, explore, or kill mobs. The zone does give a unique seahorse mount called the Vashj'ir Seahorse that was very fast, but this mount was zone restricted, meaning you can't even use it unless you're inside the zone of Vashj'ir. With this mount being obtained fairly early within the questline for Vashj'ir, and with less than half of the player base even owning it, it's fair to say that players abandoned their desire to quest here early on. There were even some very unique things in the zone, like the Leviathans who acted as buildings, or the whale shark bosses that floated around the zones. They were very popular to attack during Cataclysm, as they became a popular idea of possible secret loot tables, since they were so hard to kill. If Blizzard had decreased the questing distance or even just reduced the size of the zone, it would have been far better, because visually speaking, this is an amazing zone, but players didn't want to deal with the hassle and just went to the better alternative, Mount Hyjal, instead. Especially as this zone had massive amounts of cut content within it, something we go over in our cut content Cataclysm video, only really being out by Uldum. And at number 2, we have the Crystal Song Forest. This zone was found underneath the Wrath of the Lich King's major hub, Dalaran. Crystal Song was actually abandoned in the beta for Wrath of the Lich King after the developers found out that Dalaran lagged the entire zone, as having so many players all focus in a major city was somewhat manageable, but then adding tons of players questing within the zone, and suddenly the game begins to hit a standstill. So the few quests that were offered here were nothing like those of other zones in both quality and quantity. Because of the abandonment by Blizzard, this zone had no real important moments, or even really an overarching story, which sucks because the zone itself is stunning with the shattered crystalline trees, meaning this is likely the only zone in the entire expansion you could skip without missing any real lore, as many players did. It just had the basic collecting items quest and basic kill quests we've already done many times at this point. Crystal Song Forest was listed as a 77 to 80 level zone and was not all worth the player's time to go here instead of places like the Storm Peaks or Ice Crown, especially since Ice Crown was directly connected to Crystal Song Forest and had by far the most important lore characters and storylines of the expansion, following the Argent Crusade and Ebon Blade, as well as 3 of the most important characters of the expansion, Darian Morgraine, Tyrion Fordring, and the Lich King himself, while also giving some very good gear. And lastly, at number 1, we have Silithus. When you ask vanilla players what zone they're the most nostalgic for, or have the most memories of, you might hear Silithus a lot. But why is that? The zone was a PvP hotspot and the main hub of the opening of the Ahn'Qiraj event, while also holding AQ20 and AQ40, which had us fighting our first old god. Outside of those things, this zone was just unfinished and left by Blizzard, at launch only having a couple of quests. Silithus was one of the final areas in the game in which close to max level players would end up if they chose to level in Tanaris or Ungoro. They would usually find themselves naturally coming to the zone to see what was up. The problem with the zone was that there was practically no quests, even less than Azshara, as even Azshara had some class quests sending you there. Along with that, some of the mobs in the zone didn't drop any loot, and nearly all of the mobs were elite. Later on down Vanilla WoW's lifespan in patch 1.8, Blizzard finally added a town and more quests into the game, which improved the zone a lot, making it a viable place to get at least 1 level, which was a fair bit in the final levels. Pairing that with the fact that there was tons of quests and gear to go along with the AQ raids, the zone became extremely important and quite packed. When Cataclysm revamped the zones, Silithus was, for some reason, one of the zones that remained unchanged. In fact, there was a portal that was added leading players to the Blasted Lands, as if Blizzard themselves were saying, don't level here. Although, joking aside, it was nice to have a portal to the Blasted Lands for when you reach 58. The quests that were offered here required the player to dive into caves and clear out tons of Silithid, some with elites that were very powerful. Combined with this, and the quests themselves awarding very little experience, the zone is not worth the player's time or energy, where there are just much better zones you can go to instead. This is unless the rep it gave to you was important, which for most it was. So while the zone was worst by far pre-1.8, it then became the worst, but not by much at least. Although it seems even Blizzard agreed the zone was the worst because come the end of Legion, they had Sargeras stab the place, completely glassing the entire zone except for a few minor locations at the very edge. And of course the AQ raid itself, leaving in its wake a massive sword that towers the sky and is visible from many zones away. A great ending to a horrible zone. Now, before we end this, there's one very interesting thing to talk about with Silithus. In patch 1.8, they added a fair new things that we mentioned before, but it also finally gave it a full-fledged map, as originally this was the zone's map. Notice anything odd? Encourage is an explorable area part of the zone. The gates were locked, so we couldn't go over there, but of course there was stuff back there. But basically, it was just an open desert with some random old god structures within. Nothing special. What was special, however, was the fact that this was an explorable area on the map, meaning it may have originally been planned to be an entire section of the zone on its own, eventually unlocked and filled with max level quests to collect rep, gear, and more with the raids within. However, in 1.8, the entire section was removed from the map, as the raids themselves simply became entries at the bottom of Silithus. Although as the devs have yet to comment on this, we may really never know what the original plan was. During Legion, it was possible to get legendary items from doing almost any current content at max level. While all of them were powerful, some of them were rather niche use-wise, a fair few of them quite horrible compared to others, so we're going to be going over those ones today. And at number 10, we have the Sentinel's Internal Refuge for leather-wearing classes and the Vigilance Perch for mail-wearing classes. These two legendaries did the same thing, although with the flavor of one being a wisp and the other being a spirit owl, and with them both being crafted by leatherworkers. Legendaries allowed the player to gain a passive movement speed buff by 5% for each enemy they killed, stacking up to 5 times, and lasting for 1 minute. Upon reaching 5 stacks, the player would turn into their travel form while the player was out of combat. Now, there's a few things wrong with this. First off, you couldn't fly without having Pathfinder Part 2. It was just an instant mount. Second, it only gained stacks if you got the killing blow. So if another player got the final hit, you would not get a stack. Third, as this is not a normal mount, anything that would normally despawn upon mounting up, like guardians, bodyguards, or even sometimes pets, would not. Meaning, while flying, they would commonly pull enemies on the ground. And since his form ended if you were put in combat, them pulling or accidentally flying into a flying mob would cause you to fall to your death. Needless to say, other than it being an instant mount, it was worse than any other mount. So literally, the only thing these legendaries had going for them was they could be used while leveling, with them only really acting as stat sticks and combat speed boosts, with anyone else who used them completely ignoring their travel form effects. So great legendaries to start this list off with. And at number 9, we have the Insignia of the Grand Army. This legendary is unique because it was the only legendary that was guaranteed to drop, given to you after completing the quest and Taurus the Burning Throne, the Death of the Titan, which required the player to kill Argus the Unmaker, who was the final boss of Antorus the Burning Throne, which is the final boss of the expansion. This legendary increased the powers granted by the Netherlight Crucible, a miniature talent system added in Legion's final patch that gave the player small buffs, like an increased mastery or haste, depending on if the player chose Shadow or the Light path. The 50% increase in abilities was only slightly noticeable. Like with the temporary 1500 versatility buff, it was only a 3% increase to damage and barely 1.5% less damage taken. So when comparing this ring to other legendaries, it just wasn't as good. Like the Soul of X rings, which were a series of rings for all classes that gave them a specific talent, allowing them to have 2 rows in one of their talent rows, which was quite unique and had varying powers from spec to spec. The Insignia of the Grand Army in particular was really just a stat stick by Blizzard for players who were missing a legendary or two, be it from making a new alt or just returning to the game after being gone a long time. It was not worth using for the average player, since at the point of killing Argus the Unmaker, they would likely already have their best in slot legendary, or close to it, and this ring offered nothing more than an ever so slight buff that was just not worth using, especially as it was heavily RNG dependent on what actual options you had in the Netherlight Crucible. It was a guaranteed legendary for alts who killed him in LFR at the very least. And at number 8, we have Sinidari the Symbiote. This was a leather belt equipable by all leather wearers, and it caused the player to do an additional 30% damage to enemies who were above 90% health, and to cause the player to be healed for 100% of the extra damage that it did. The reason why this belt is on this list is because after an enemy hit less than 90% health, the extra damage bonus just went away. For heavy burst damage specs like Feral Druids, this belt did help their burst potential by a noticeable amount, and pushed a raid boss to sub 90% as fast as possible, such as Odin in Halls of Valor, as his fight ended when he reached 80% health. On all other bosses though, this bonus was short-lived, especially since most raids Lust used potions and had room buffs on pool. The damage bonus was there for a very short amount of time before permanently disappearing. Originally, the legendary did not have a heal component to it, but it did do 50% more damage, with patch 7.1.5 changing it to what it is now. There were far better alternatives that leather-wearing classes could use that could give them consistent damage output, like the Soul of the Archdruids for the Ferals, or Dustwalker footpads for rogues as examples, and dedicating a legendary slot that doesn't provide any benefit when an enemy is lower than 90% health was more harmful than helpful, as it simply didn't do anything past that point. For example, being literally useless against the final boss in the Eye of Ajara, who starts combat almost dead. Although I guess it could help you one-shot mobs out in the open world if you were doing world quests. And at number 7, we have the Eye of the Twisting Nether legendary for shamans. This legendary made it so whenever the shaman would attack with fire, frost, or nature abilities, it would give a stacking buff that would increase all their damage by 1.5%, stacking for each of the different kinds of damage dealt. So at maximum stacks, it would increase your damage by 4.5%. Now, normally a shaman would only be able to keep 2 of the stacks up at a time, because none of the specs really used frost damage very much. But it was possible for an enhancement shaman to get 100% uptime on this buff, by using the Hailstorm talent, which caused their frostband ability to add an extra frost damage to their melee attacks. However, generally, taking this talent was a DPS loss, and wasn't really worth taking in order to just have 100% uptime on the Twisting Nether buff, unless they also had the wrist legendary Akainu's Absolute Justice, which incentivized actually using Frostband in a DPS situation. The reason why this legendary is on this list is because 4.5% increase in damage is not very noticeable, especially when compared to the other legendaries, like the Uncertain Reminder, which made Bloodlust/Heroism last 75% longer on shamans, or the Breast legendary, Smoldering Heart, which gave them a chance per Maelstrom spent to gain Ascendance for 10 seconds and substantially increase their damage. Combined with the Melon's Charged Core, which causes shaman to do 10% more damage if their Crash Lightning hit more than 3 targets, there was no reason to ever use this legendary unless it was the only one you managed to get. Or if you wanted to have a fun meme build with Ikuno's Absolute Justice that could put out non-terrible damage. Funnily enough, this legendary originally increased damage by 2% per stack, but was nerfed to 1.5% in patch 7.1.5 when they rebalanced legendaries, to try and counter the small bit of meme potential it had. And at number 6, we have Eco Wraith, Creator of Worlds. This legendary, which was only usable by druids, increased their specs passive depending on what spec they were playing. For example, Thick Hide for Guardian, Astral Influence for Balance, Feline Swiftness for Feral, or Ysera's Gift for Restoration. Legendary was considered the worst for the druid class, so much so that Blizzard ended up buffing it from 50% increase to a 75% increase. But even then, the difference that it would offer wasn't that great. Thick Hide was increased from 6% to 10.5%, which needless to say was not really worth an entire legendary slot, considering how ridiculously strong some of them were. This is okay for doing high-level Mythic Plus keys, as the damage they could take could get to absurd levels, before Blizzard changed Mythic Plus dungeons anyway, but the Dual Determination legendary was just better as it gave Survival Instincts 1 additional charge and made it recharge 15% faster. Even Lufa Wrappings, which increased the damage and radius of their Thrash by 25%. For the other specs passives, it wasn't much of a bonus either. As for balance, you only gained an additional 3.75 yards on your abilities. However, it did have some use for Feral, which increased their passive movement speed buff from 15% to 26%, which could make Feral Druids go very fast. But with the Feral Druid using the Chatoyan Signet and the Lufa Wrapping legendary combo, or the Chatoyan Signet and the Soul of the Archdruid combo, their best in-slot legendary duos, there was still no reason to ever use this legendary. Outside of old world content like transmog farming, where it at least saw some use for Feral. And at number 5, we have Narrow Band of Promises. This is a Discipline Priest legendary that had the ability where, when your penance damaged an enemy, it also healed all allies affected by your power word barrier. Now, Penance is one of the main damage abilities that Discipline Priests use. On a 9-second cooldown, it deals damage when targeting an enemy, or heals when targeting an ally. And the Disc Priest heals primarily through Atonement, which is a buff that gets applied on everyone that they heal that converts about 50% of all the damage you deal into healing on all targets with that Atonement buff. And Power Word Barrier is a great cooldown, where you throw down a barrier in a location which reduces all damage everyone inside of it takes by 25% for 10 seconds. And since Penance is one of the hardest hitting abilities you had, well, outside of the artifact weapon in that expansion, it seems like this legendary does a good job of converting your power word barrier into an actual healing cooldown. But there were a couple of problems with this legendary that kind of made using it useless. For one, there were very few fights in Legion which had the entire raid stacking under the barrier, where you wouldn't even be able to get the full benefit of being able to heal your entire raid with that penance. Also, the heal it did was basically coded internally to act exactly like Atonement, so it was only healing for half of the damage of that penance, and you could only realistically use a single penance during a power word barrier's duration. So this was not a lot of healing for an item taking up one of your precious few legendary slots. And the ring itself didn't even have haste on it, which was one of the best stats that Disciplined Priest wanted the most. So the main ability it modified just wasn't very useful in that expansion, and even in situations in which it was useful, it wasn't as impactful as any other legendary. Although to be fair, the two best legendaries for Disciplined Priests were just two generic legendaries. First one being Pride As, which is a generic necklace that just gave you an absorption shield every 30 seconds, which, funny enough, was seen as the worst legendary at the start of the expansion, but quickly became one of the best for progressions. And Velen's Future Sight, which was a generic healing trinket. Basically, all of the Disciplined Priest specific legendaries were just straight up worse than two generic legendaries when it came to raiding environments. So Nero's Band of Promises might not even be the worst of the Priest legendaries, because almost none of them were actually used in competitive environments. This is just one I remember standing out as a legendary that seemed really useful, but in practice was actually very lackluster. And at number 4, we have Fragment of the Betrayer's Prison. This was a Vengeance Demon Hunter exclusive legendary which gave 20% additional leech while their Demon Spikes ability was active. Demon Spikes was a core part of the Vengeance Demon Hunter's rotation, seeing as this was their main way of reducing damage and allowed them to tank even larger groups of enemies while having great sustain and their built-in self-healing. This legendary, however, wasn't as great as Oblivion's Embrace, their best legendary, which gave them an additional Demon Spikes and Empowered War Charge. Archimonde's Hatred Reborn was also one of their best legendaries, funnily enough, which was also a generic tank trinket, and when used, gave them an Absorb Shield for 30% of their health that lasted for 10 seconds. And after expiring or being fully consumed, it would explode for 75% of the damage absorbed, split between all nearby enemies. This was fantastic for huge area of effect damage, as it allowed them to not only survive burst phases longer with the shield, which was somewhat of a tough spot for Demon Hunter tanks in Legion, but also deal out huge damage quickly, seeing as the entire point of Mythic Plus Dungeon was to finish the dungeon as fast as possible. The best combination of legendaries Vengeance Demon Hunters could have was Oblivion's Embrace and Archimonde's Hatred Reborn. Or if the Demon Hunter did not have Archimonde's Hatred Reborn, they could substitute it for Rune Master's Pauldrons instead, which made Metamorphosis now also reset the remaining cooldown of all other sigils and grant them one charge of Demon Spikes. There was just no reason to ever use this one over most of the other Demon Hunter legendaries, as they were superior in nearly every way to it. And at number 3, we have Celerity of the Windrunners. This was a Marksman Hunter legendary which increased haste by 15% for 6 seconds when they used their Wind Burst, an ability tied to the Marksman artifact weapon which did a lot of damage and left a speed boost on the ground for the party to run through, for a 50% increased movement speed for 5 seconds. Seeing as haste was the worst stat for Marksman Hunter during Legion, and pretty much every expansion, this went from being a mediocre legendary to a must avoid. Ullr's Feather Snowshoes was their best legendary, which reduced the cooldown of their main DPS cooldown, True Shot, whenever the hunter cast a damaging shot by 0.8 seconds. 1 second originally, before being nerfed in 7.1.5. A close second for Marksman was War Belt of the Sentinel Army, which made their multi-shot increase the damage of their next aim shot for each enemy hit by 10%, stacking to 200% max. Marksman was never really known for their strong AoE damage, and usually their strong single target damage. And this legendary made any potential AoE to allow you to do massive single target damage. Having longer uptime on their DPS cooldown or better AoE damage is just simply better in every way than extra haste, which Marksman never needed anyways. And at number 2, we have the crafted legendary called Celimbra, the Knight's Dichotomy, which was an exclusive legendary for cloth wearers. This made it so whenever an enemy was in 12 yards of the player would conceal themselves in shadows, which reduced their damage taken by 5% and increased their movement speed by 10%. And when there weren't any enemies around, the player would heal for 1% of their maximum health every second. Legendaries could not be used in PvP during Legion, and the damage reduction and movement speed were just not that good, especially as they only really worked in melee, making this legendary really only a typical casters don't like melee armor piece. And while the 1% heal per second was nice, it only worked at range, meaning that it only really worked outside of combat or against ranged enemies, which is already not super useful because of the self-healing that priests and warlocks have, only really leaving mages to get any benefit. The only decent side with this legendary was that it was good for leveling and solo content, and for said mages. Otherwise, it was just a waste of materials of gold if you decided to obtain it. And at the number 1 spot on this list, we have March of the Legion, a monk legendary ring which increased their movement speed of their Windwalker passive ability by an additional 15%. This offered no damage increases at all, but the extra movement speed was noticeable and did benefit all allies within 10 yards of the monk. But dedicating a legendary slot to a ring that only increased your movement speed was usually not worth the trade-off, especially when there were legendaries like Drinking Horn Cover, which extended the duration of their main DPS burst ability, Storm, Earth, and Fire. And there were a lot of other much better legendaries for Windwalker monks too, such as the Wind Blows, a helmet that made Strike of the Windlord, their artifact ability, have a 20% shorter cooldown and make their next blackout kick, which was the main part of the rotation, cost no chi to use as well. The Emperor's Capacitator was also one of their best single target legendaries too, as this made their Crackling Jade Lightning increase damage by 50%, and reduces cost by 5%, stacking up to 20 times whenever the monk spent chi. And as an additional unique effect, the buff for this had no duration, much like Weakener's Loyalty, basically the same effect but for Demonology Warlock's artifact ability. This transformed the ability from one of the weakest to one of the strongest parts of the rotation. Monks having these legendaries that all fit their playstyle quite well left this ring behind, as it did nothing more than increase their movement speed by a minor amount, with its only real use being farming old world content, as when you were one-shotting everything, 15% movement speed is actually quite good. WoW's biggest selling point has always been their raids, but some are obviously better than others, which means some will be at the bottom by default. WoW doesn't really have universally hated raids, but it does have some that people didn't like as much as the others, which is what I'll be going over in this list. And at number 10, we have Wrath Naxxramas. Now, the whole reason this instance is on this list is because it's literally just a copy-paste job from vanilla WoW. Blizzard felt as if not enough people actually got to do Naxxramas when it was current content in vanilla WoW, so they thought it was the perfect raid to have as an intro raid for Wrath of the Lich King. And they were right about that. Very few people actually got to do Naxxramas in vanilla WoW because it was incredibly difficult and raiding skills on a whole were kind of low. However, the raid design was obviously around having 40 players. So when they put it in the game and they had a 25 player max, they had to nerf a lot of the encounters. The 4 Horsemen fight didn't require 8 tanks like it did in vanilla, and Instructor Razuvius didn't require a priest for mind control, and a few other things. Basically, Wrath of the Lich King Naxx was kind of easy compared to its vanilla counterpart, and the whole instance was cleared in less than a day after it was first attempted, or all of 3 days after the launch of the expansion. Although the reason it was cleared so fast is probably the reason why classic servers have their bosses cleared so fast, and that was because a lot of people already done the instance in the past and kind of knew what to do already. And figuring out new boss fights is usually what eats up a lot of time and progression. However, Blizzard was right about people not having experienced the place before. So for a lot of people, they had a great time being able to actually do Naxxramas. So it's not hated or anything, just in the bottom 10 of the raids. And at number 9, we have Mogushan Vaults. Mogushan Vaults was one of the 3 raids that was released at the launch of Mists of Pandaria, and was also the first one to be cleared. Now, the raid instance itself had you raiding a vault in order to get to an ancient Titan artifact, which the Thunder King used in order to build his armies. And there's nothing really bad about the raid, it's just none of the bosses are really standout encounters. Some of them look really cool, Elegon especially, but the final boss is basically a twin-style ad fight, where the tanks and melee DPS have a neat mechanic of dodging abilities, while everyone else just control ads the whole time. Generally, a fight which involves a lot of ad killing are not very well liked. Although Mogushan Vaults is just simply forgettable, and definitely doesn't have very much negative sentiment. And at number 8, we have the Crucible of Storms in BFA. This was a 2-boss mini-raid after Battle for Dazar lore, which is surprisingly very well liked in the competitive Mythic raiding community. And that's because its final boss, Unat, was just like one of the hardest raid bosses of all time. This raid was incredibly difficult, and also incredibly purple. Both boss fights took place in purple rooms with purple walls and purple ceilings and a purple tint, and also had tons of abilities that put purple void zones everywhere, which kind of blended in with everything else. The first fight was like a 3-boss console-like fight, and the last boss was just a really hard encounter. Although the last boss was so hard that many guilds just never did the raid again after they completed it a single time. The gear from the place was pretty unique, as pretty much everything that dropped had some kind of unique effect attached to it. For some reason, the raid just had a very low participation rate, and there were very few repeat clears across the board. I'm honestly not sure why this raid had so few fans, although if I were to guess, it would probably be because the aesthetic of the place was pretty dull, and the final boss was overly hard for the rewards it provided. And at number 7, we have the Eye of Eternity from Wrath of the Lich King. This is a one-boss raid which was at the launch of Wrath of the Lich King, and made very heavy use of the brand new vehicle mechanics that Blizzard was pushing really hard this expansion. As for the last part of the fight, the platform is destroyed and everyone has to hop on a Drake in order to DPS down the final boss, using a preset amount of abilities. There were abilities that allowed you to tank, heal, and DPS, and all players got access to all abilities. So if you wanted, you could have a healer be the tank for the final portion, and a tank be a healer or DPS, although generally you would just stick to your normal roles. Now, part of the problems with this raid are the fact that the first phase required a lot of movement and constant healing, so there were only a couple of healer classes that could comfortably heal the place, when gear itself was kind of low and unavailable. And also, you had to learn how to use the vehicle mechanics mid-fight, and since this was kind of a new thing at the time, this one boss raid was actually pretty difficult for a lot of pug groups. And people were more willing to pug the entirety of Naxxramas than do Eye of Eternity. And also, players got really tired of the vehicle mechanics halfway through the expansion, so anything that had vehicle mechanics was kind of hated by default. And at number 6, we have the Throne of Four Winds from Cataclysm. This is a short 2-boss raid added with the launch of Cataclysm, which had its final boss completed by a pretty funny, unique method, where they literally left 7 of the raid members outside the boss room, because it was easier to do the fight with less than 20 people, because of the way the mechanics of the platform worked. And the final boss of the raid actually is one of the longest lived bosses in the game, as it took 36 days before the first kill was accomplished. And Throne of Four Winds can probably put into the same category as Crucible of Storms, where it wasn't very well liked because it was overly hard for a pretty small 2-boss encounter. Although, personally, I love the aesthetics of this raid. I think it's 10 times better than the Crucible of Storms, and I thought Alakir was a pretty fun final boss. It was incredibly difficult, and the first boss of the instance was kind of weird, but I wouldn't say it was bad. You had to constantly jump from platform to platform in order to DPS down the 3 bosses, who had to die within a certain amount of time of each other, and sometimes the platform would just miss you and you would fall into the abyss, and slowly be pulled back up to one of the 3 platforms and just kind of mess everything up. And at number 5, we have the Dragon Soul from Cataclysm. This was the final raid instance of the Cataclysm, and is largely thought of as the worst final raid instance of any expansion, for a few reasons I'll go over in a bit. Although, personally, I love this place, and it's probably one of my favorites. Now, Dragon Soul was only an 8-boss raid, and people were not very happy that the final raid of the expansion only had 8 bosses in it. In fact, Cataclysm probably has less bosses than Warlord of Draenor, which was the expansion that literally was missing an entire raid tier. Although the amount of bosses in a raid don't really matter too much, it's just the quality of the bosses was also kind of meh as well. You see, the raid itself sounds pretty amazing in practice. You're storming a temple and fighting through minions of the old gods, making it to the top of the temple where you blast Deathwing in the back. Then you have to hop on a gunship in order to chase after him, where you parachute onto his back in order to pop off his plate so that he falls into the ocean, where you then finally finish him off. This has got to be one of the most thematic raid instances we've ever gotten, which is trying to tell a pretty dramatic action story, instead of just slowly going to separate boss rooms and killing people who are just waiting for you. But when you actually get to Dragon Soul, you basically do just go to separate boss rooms with people who are just waiting for you for the first 5 bosses. Then you get to the dramatic chase sequence for the final 3 bosses, which is where most of the problems lie. The boss fight on the gunship battle is probably one of the buggiest fights I've ever done, and is the longest I've ever spent progressing on a single boss because half of our wipes were due to just the fight not working correctly. The Spine of Deathwing encounter encouraged class stacking on a tier that I hadn't seen in years, and the final boss was just a huge letdown, as it was basically just a giant tentacle boss fight, where you're fighting tentacles the entire time instead of a giant dragon like people were promised. And in fact, the final boss was easier than the second to last boss, where you're just fighting oozes on the back of a dragon. And even with all of these problems, I really liked the place. I thought Spine of Deathwing was one of the most fun fights I've ever done. And even if I do see all the problems with it, looking back on it objectively, I just have heavy nostalgia goggles when it comes to Cataclysm. And at number 4, we have the Ruby Sanctum from Wrath of the Lich King. This was a one-boss raid released after ICC and was kind of released as a filler raid in order to better hold people over for the new expansion, which was taking a long time to come out, as the end of Wrath of the Lich King was the first time WoW had a long content drought, which became the standard after the fact. But since this was the first time, Blizzard tried to throw the players a bone and gave them a quick one-boss raid. However, players didn't really like it. A lot of people felt as if it cheapened the final expansion and end boss, i.e. the Lich King, if this random dragon nobody ever heard of was now the final boss of the expansion. And the raid and boss itself wasn't particularly difficult or a pushover. I thought it was perfectly fine when I did it back in the day. Honestly, I don't really agree with a lot of the complaints that were thrown at the Ruby Sanctum. I personally would love it if they did more one-raid bosses like this, especially during a content drought. Although, because people freaked out so much about the Ruby Sanctum, they never tried to really have a filler raid tier like this ever again. And it's also one of the people's least favorite raids because of that, even if the raid itself was perfectly fine. Again, WoW doesn't really have bad raids, just one's not as good as others. And at number 3, we have the Tomb of Sargeras from Legion. This was the second raid tier of the Legion expansion, and the 4th raid release totaled from that time period. Tomb of Sargeras holds the distinction of being one of the hardest raids of all time, mainly because it has 2 of the hardest raid bosses of all time, the Avatar of Sargeras and Kil'jaeden. If you want to see what absolute monsters these 2 boss fights were, I highly suggest you just watch my video on the hardest raid bosses of all time, because I dedicate about 10 minutes to both of them. But, suffice to say, the difficulties of these bosses is not why this raid is not looked back on fondly. It's mainly because Tomb of Sargeras really went hand with the soak mechanics. You see, a soak mechanic is when a void zone is being put out in the raid, and you need players to go into that void zone in order to soak the damage. Otherwise it explodes and does much more damage to the rest of the raid. Now, WoW raids have had soak mechanics all the time, but for some reason they just doubled down on them in Tomb of Sargeras. And some raid fights would have soak mechanics within soak mechanics, and the final boss had a phase where you needed half the raid to go out and have someone soak. Otherwise the whole group would just wipe with a single person missed one of them. And because they were so unforgiving, it definitely increased the difficulty of the plays on a whole. And some of the fights just had ridiculous personal accountability, which isn't a big problem for competitive players, but was definitely a problem for everyone else playing the game. Like the Maiden of Vigilance, for example, where she split the group arbitrarily with debuffs, where if you crossed someone in the raid who had the opposing debuff, it would just wipe the group. And she would routinely change this around, so you'd have to constantly swap to different sides of the room. There's also a bomb mechanic that goes up periodically, where you literally have to jump into a hole in order for the bomb to explode and send you back onto the platform. And of course, if you didn't jump into the hole, the bomb would just blow up the entire group. And if you jumped too early, then the bomb wouldn't push you up far enough in order to get back on the platform. And if you somehow didn't turn your character around, it wasn't going to push you back on the platform either. And if you jumped at the same time as another player, you'd both just kill each other by accident. And then there was another mechanic where you just play Pac-Man and have to run into balls which have the same color as a debuff. And if you collect the wrong color, then you blow up the group. Basically, all these mechanics are super easy for competitive players, but the amount of personal responsibility required for even the lower difficulties was just way too high. There were too many instant failed mechanics, and the final boss of the raid had one of the lowest participation rates out of any of the bosses from the entire expansion. And unlike Unat and Crucible of Storms, you can't really blame most of that on the expansion itself being unpopular, because Legion was one of the most well-liked expansions in recent history. Tomb of Sargeras was just really hard, and Blizzard immediately backtracked on a lot of the mechanic decisions they made for this raid. And don't layer personal responsibility raid wipe mechanics on top of each other one-on-one, like they did with half of the bosses in Tomb of Sargeras. And at number 2, we have the Trial of the Crusader. This was a short 5-boss raid, which all took place in one room, and had absolutely no trash to fight. And it's also the raid which introduced the first iteration of the normal and heroic modes. And this whole raid is just kind of a perfect storm of things just kind of going wrong, that makes a lot of people look back on it very unfavorably. For one, it kind of has the same problem as the Ruby Sanctum, where it cuts a popular raid short, as it was released right after Ulduar and before ICC, 2 of the most popular raids of all time. And the gear from the raid was better than what you can get in Ulduar, so it incentivized people to no longer run that place, which was doubly so by the fact that Trial of the Crusader had 4 different lockouts. You could do the place on 10-man normal, 10-man heroic, 25-man normal, and 25-man heroic all in the same week, which meant you could get gear from all 4 versions of the place. And again, Since the gear was better than what you got from Old War, many people were running the same raid 4 times each week, which all took place in one small little room, which really hampered people's opinion on the place on a whole. Even if the raid bosses themselves were perfectly acceptable. Well, except for faction champions. That one is kind of divisive. It's either one of the most unique raid fights of all time, or one of the worst, as it's kind of a mishmash of a PvP/PvE type fight, where it encourages you to use crowd control abilities. And since people were clearing the place 4 times a week, they were not super happy that one of the fights was unconventional, and required them to do the raid differently than normal. If Trial of the Crusader was just released alongside another short raid, kind of like the Mogushan Vaults was, and didn't have the terrible mechanic of 4 raid lockouts, making people burn themselves out in the place even faster than normal, I'm sure it wouldn't be looked back on anywhere near as negatively as it is currently. It was just kind of a perfect storm of a whole bunch of things going wrong for it that don't really have much to do with the raid itself, and how the bosses or mechanics were run, except for faction champions. That fight doesn't really help its case very much. And since Trial of the Crusader was also sandwiched between 2 of the most popular raids of all time, it's being heavily compared to the best, which makes it seem even lower on the scale that much more. And at number 1, we have the Battle for Mount Hyjal. This was a raid in the Burning Crusade, which is generally thought of as one of the worst raids in the game, and very few people defend it, like they might do with every other raid I've listed on this list. Where even I quite enjoyed some of the raids I talked about here. There's very few people who actually enjoyed the Battle for Mount Hyjal, because what the raid was waiting around for ads to spawn, so the raid would allow you to kill the ads slowly before the next wave could come in. The whole raid took place in around 3 sections. The first section had you kill waves of ads, then a boss, then waves of ads, then another boss. The second section had you kill waves of ads, then a boss, then more waves of ads, and then a 4th boss. And the third section had you just kill a final boss. So most of the raid was just spent killing ads, and generally, people call ads before a fight trash for a reason. It's the common nomenclature for this activity to be called killing trash. You can kind of see how the community thinks of the entertainment value of killing large swatches of trash for the majority of the instance. Because also, if you fail the boss fight, you'd have to redo all the waves of trash before it would respawn again. So Battle for Mount Hyjal easily takes number 1 spot on this list. It's the closest thing WoW has to a bad raid, and the only reason it took so long to clear was because no one really wanted to do it back when it was available, and instead everybody just was working on Illidan. When Azerite traits were first introduced, they were promoted as being spec-defining traits that would change how you play your class, similar to artifact weapons in the legendaries of Legion. And while that was true for a small handful of them, most of them were pretty mediocre, or just provided flat bonuses that you'd mostly forget about. And in this list, we'll be going over a lot of that latter. And at number 10, we have Snake Eyes. This is an Outlaw Rogue trait, which has the ability that after using Roll the Bones or Slice and Dice, your next 10 Sinister Strikes deal additional damage based on the amount of combo points you spent. Sinister Strike is simply the main basic attack that Outlaw Rogues use, in order to build up their combo points. Roll the Bones is just the buff that Outlaw Rogues use to cast on themselves. Slice and Dice is a talent you pick up which replaces Roll the Bones. So, in the most simplest terms, the rotation for the Outlaw Rogue in BFA was to use Sinister Strike until you had 5 combo points, then you would use those 5 combo points on Roll the Bones. Then, out of combo points, you would build up 5 more combo points again, and this time you would use your 5 combo points on Dispatch, a hard-hitting single-target ability, unless you had to refresh your stacks, in addition to the normal procs and cooldowns you use in between all that. So this trait pretty obviously just gives you extra damage on your main combo point builder after you use your combo spender buff ability. So what's so bad about this trait? Actually, when the trait was first released, it was really good, and in fact was part of a meme build which did competitive damage. You see, Outlaw Rogues are supposed to use one-handed weapons that are not daggers, and in order to force them to do this, the main damage-dealing combo point spender ability, Dispatch, requires you to have a non-dagger one-handed weapon in order to use. So Outlaw Rogues were actually able to use Snake Eyes with the dagger in the main hand by just never using Dispatch, and only using their combo points in order to activate Slice and Dice. Slice and Dice is a talent that replaces your Roll the Bones, and makes it so when you spend your combo points on it, it just increases your attack speed by 15%, as well as your energy regeneration. The Mastery for Outlaw Rogues gives your main hand attack a chance to proc an extra offhand attack. So if you have a very fast dagger in your main hand, and then just have whatever's your hardest hitting one-handed weapon in your offhand, you can proc your Mastery a lot more often with the very fast dagger using Slice and Dice. However, you wouldn't be able to spend your combo points on your main damage dealing ability, which was offset by taking 3 Snake Eyes traits, and making it so your Sinister Strike was doing so much damage especially if you took the Weapon Master talent so it had a chance to hit twice, that you didn't need to use Dispatch. So the whole rotation was just spamming Sinister Strike until you used up all of your Snake Eyes charges, and then refreshing it with the 5 combo point Slice and Dice. However, Blizzard didn't like that rogues were not playing their class correctly, since you were supposed to use Dispatch in your rotation. So they nerfed the build, and the way they did it was by targeting the trait itself. The original version of the trait used to buff your next 5 Sinister Strikes for a large amount of damage. So what they did was just increase it to 10, and then cut the amount of extra damage in half, essentially adding the same amount of extra damage to your next 10 Sinister Strikes instead of the next 5. Which meant you could no longer use your combo points on Slice and Dice in order to deal competitive damage by just spamming Sinister Strike 5 times in between, which would force you to use your combo points on other things and require you to not have a dagger in your main hand. So basically, they super nerfed the trait to stop a meme build, which also just made the trait really bad for everyone else. They also didn't even increase the duration of the buff, so you only had 12 seconds to use up all 10 stacks of the trait, which meant it was almost impossible to even use the full benefit of it. So this trait was nerfed pretty early on in BFA and was almost completely useless for the rest of the expansion. However, since the trait was useful for a time and wasn't removed, it's only at the number 10 spot on this list. But for a majority of its lifespan in BFA, it was the absolute worst trait to pick up for Outlaw Rogues. And at number 9, we have Masterful Instincts. This is a trait available to Feral and Guardian Druids and has the effect where you gain a pretty significant amount of mastery and armor for 30 seconds after Survival Instincts expires. Survival Instincts is a defensive cooldown which reduces all the damage you take by 50% for 6 seconds. Now, the mastery it provides is actually really good, including the extra armor, so it was one of the most taken Azerite traits for Feral Druids in high-end arenas. However, it didn't really perform well anywhere else, because generally you want to save your defensive cooldowns for emergencies, and this trait actively encourages you to use your defensive cooldowns as an offensive cooldown for that 30-second buff afterwards. In PvP, where you're using defensive cooldowns all the time anyway, this isn't really a big deal. If you're a tank or DPS player in a regular raid or dungeon, generally you want your defensive cooldowns for specific phases of fights, or for emergencies. And while Survival Instincts did have 2 charges in BFA, you could always just use one of them for the 30-second buff and then save the other one for an emergency, or just pick any other trait which would increase your damage survivability without relying on using up one of your major defensive cooldowns. And at number 8, we have Moment of Compassion. This is a trait for Holy Paladins and has the effect where your Flash of Light will heal for an additional amount when you use it on the target of your Beacon of Light. Beacon of Light is an ability that Paladins have, where you place it on one target, which lasts until you move it to another target, that makes it so 50% of all of your healing is duplicated to your Beacon of Light target. So it's an excellent ability, where usually you just set it on a very high priority healing target, like a tank, and then you don't have to heal them because Beacon of Light is constantly duplicating your heals towards them. Flash of Light is just the fast cast high healing single target healing spell that Paladins have. Here's the thing with Beacon of Light though. Normally, you don't want to spend your direct healing on your Beacon of Light target. Placed a Beacon of Light on a target has the excellent benefit where you don't have to heal them. It's an incredibly strong ability because it allows you to always split your healing to another target. So, having an Azerite trait which only benefits you healing suboptimally is obviously not very good. However, there are situations in which it is somewhat useful. Paladins have a talent called Beacon of Virtue, which on a 15-second cooldown allows you to place a Beacon of Light on one target and 3 other targets within 30 yards for 8 seconds. So with 4 Beacon of Light targets out in a Mythic Plus dungeon scenario, then this Azerite trait would be live on half the party. Even then, pretty much every single other trait is better, and it was almost never taken, easily being the least taken trait amongst Holy Paladins, especially since Holy Paladins had, arguably, one of the best Azerite traits ever in the form of Glimmer of Light. Glimmer of Light was so good that pretty much all guides in BFA told you to get 3 of them as soon as possible, because it was going to define your entire healing rotation. You can only have 6 major traits, and with half of them taken up by only one trait, you would definitely not want to waste one of those remaining slots on Moment of Clarity, which was almost completely useless in raids, and only sometimes useful in Mythic Plus dungeons if you had the right talent. Although in PvP, healing your Beacon of Light target is pretty common, so it has more staying power there. And at number 7, we have Flames of Alacrity. This is a major fire mage trait, which would grant additional haste whenever your Enhanced Pyrotechnics was activated. Enhanced Pyrotechnics would activate every time your Fireball spell failed to critically hit, in which case it would increase the chance of your next Fireball to crit by a stacking amount until you finally landed a successful critical strike. as fire mages are all about getting crits so they can spam instant cast Pyroblasts. Now, where this trait comes into practice is if you're hard casting a lot of fireballs back to back and are unlucky with none of them critting. Then you can benefit from this Azerite trait and get the extra haste. When the trait provided a significant amount of haste before it was nerfed, it was used occasionally, but other than that, it was mostly ignored in favor of traits or abilities which actually played towards what fire was trying to do, rather than only benefiting from a failure state. Because as soon as you successfully landed a critical strike with a fireball, the trait would no longer be active. And at number 6, we have Killer Frost. This is a trait exclusive to Frost Death Knights, and it has the ability where your Frost Strike deals additional damage and also has a 15% chance on your critical strikes to grant Killing Machine. Killing Machine is a proc which makes your next obliterate a critical strike. Now, Frost Strike is the basic ability that Death Knights use when they need to spend their runic power, as it's a great way for them to deal damage with it, and Obliterate is just one of their hard-hitting abilities. So passively allowing it to crit more often is only a good thing. Plus the trait increases the damage of the runic spender. So what's wrong with this, and why was it the least picked trait for Frost Death Knights? Well, the extra damage it would give to Frost Strike was fine. It's just the proc chance would only happen if you critically strike with Frost Strike, instead of just using any Frost Strike. You see, Azerite traits would not stack when it comes to percentage-based things. So if you stacked 3 copies of Killer Frost, you would still only have a 15% chance to grant extra killing machines on your crits. Which, sure, overall it would give you more procs over a boss fight, but also, any of the mediocre generic traits would increase your damage more. And that's kind of the threshold for some of these traits. Is it better to take the trait than just one of the bad generic traits? Like, don't get me wrong, some of the generic traits are super good, so saying a spec-specific trait is worse than one of them isn't that big of a deal. Like the Heart of Darkness trait, for example, which was good for pretty much every class. Killer Frost was usually worse than traits like Razan's Fury or even Incite the Pack, which were definitely great traits for some classes, but pretty mediocre overall when it came to generic traits. Killer Frost wasn't especially good at single target or AoE. It technically did increase your damage, but it wasn't more useful than a generic trait. And that's kind of the benchmark for a lot of the traits that appear on this list. And at number 5, we have Up Close and Personal. This was a Survival Hunter Azerite trait, which increased the damage of your next Mongoose Bite or Raptor Strike by a set amount after you use your Harpoon ability, while also reducing its focus cost by 10. Harpoon is like a charge, where it pulls your character towards your target and roots them in place. It had a 20-second cooldown and cost a minimal amount of focus, and Raptor Strike was just one of your focus spenders, with Mongoose Bite being a talent you could take which would replace it. Now, this trait functions more like an optional talent you might take while leveling up, rather than an ability you choose on a piece of gear at endgame content that you want to stack other copies of on top of it in order to grant more of the effect. Because you see, Harpoon has a minimum range of 8 yards, so if you're in a raid fight and you want to make use of this Azerite trait on cooldown, you'd have to run out of the fight in order to Harpoon back in just for the buff. And losing that downtime was just not really worth the minor buff to one of your attacks. Especially since you had to give up that global cooldown, assuming you didn't lose any other global cooldowns while running out of range. There was a talent, however, called Terms of Engagement, which would reset the cooldown of Harpoon after killing an enemy. So the Azerite trait seems like it'd be more useful while leveling up in conjunction with this talent, or maybe even in dungeons situationally. Although I don't know if that makes it good. The trait was actually removed from the game in patch 8.1, and replaced with another trait called Primeval Intuition, which increased your maximum focus to 120, and gave your Raptor Strike or Mongoose Bite a crit buff each time they did damage and stacked up to 5 times. And also, funny enough, 8.1 is also when they removed the global cooldown from Harpoon, which would have made the trait a little bit more useful in the type of content that it was probably designed for. And at number 4, we have Synapse Shock. This is a Shaman trait available to all specs, which simply has the effect that each time you cast Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning, you increase your intellect by a set amount for each target hit for 15 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. So after you stack this thing up 5 times, you basically have a permanent intellect buff as an Elemental Shaman, and one that could be used with the other 2 specs as well, although none of the Shaman specs really use the trait. When it first came out at the launch of BFA, it provided so much intellect and was so easy to have up 100% of the time that it was kind of the go-to pick for Elemental Shamans. And since the trait was so incredibly easy to use and was basically just an extra buff that you didn't have to think about, Blizzard nerfed the trait so it wouldn't be an auto pick. Then it became grossly undertuned to the point where it was one of the worst possible options you could pick, while also still being the same boring trait from before. And that's kind of how it stayed for the rest of the expansion. They never really touched it again. There were a couple of other Shaman traits which were also incredibly undertuned, to the point where they competed with Snapshot in which one was the least useful. And at number 3, we have Moment of Repose. This is a trait for Discipline Priests, which had the ability that when you applied pain suppression to a target, it would also apply atonement to that target and instantly heal them for a set amount, which was usually a significant amount, either equivalent or slightly higher than what you would get from casting a single target big heal. Pain suppression is a longer cooldown that you can apply on yourself or a friendly target, which reduces the damage they take by 40% for 8 seconds. And it's actually a super good defensive cooldown in pretty much all types of max level gameplay. It's useful as an emergency button to push if you know you're about to take a lot of damage. It's useful to throw on the tank if they ask for a defensive cooldown, or just on someone who's about to die in a dungeon or raid. And in PvP, it's absolutely crucial to the Disc Priest survivability. Now, the trait adding a heal and applying atonement, which is a good buff that allows you to heal the target for some of the damage you deal, is just straight up a plus to the ability. And in PvP, this could be amazing to add an extra heal whenever you're using pain suppression on a target. Everywhere else though, it was a huge shame this took up one of your major Azerite traits, because it is incredibly lackluster outside of PvP. The ability the trait is tied to is only used for emergencies, unless you're doing some kind of mechanic where you're going to be using pain suppression off cooldown. And because it's an emergency ability, chances are you won't even use the ability a single time in an encounter. Or you can go through an entire dungeon without having to use it a single time, which is great that you never had any emergencies, but that also means you had a useless major Azerite slot being taken up by an ability that didn't help contribute at all. The situations in which you might need to emergency pain suppress, the extra heal provides is pretty nice, but pain suppression is so good on its own that it's not really needed. And when you preemptively use pain suppression, you don't need the healing at all because most of the time the target will be at full health. So while it's technically a beneficial trait, like most of the Azerite traits on this list, it's definitely not as useful as pretty much anything else you could take, which could meaningfully help you at all times instead of maybe sometimes in emergencies if things are going wrong. And at number 2, we have Rumbling Tremors. This is a trait that definitely won out when it comes to being the least useful shaman trait. Rumbling Tremors is a trait which allowed your Earth Elemental to pulse AoE damage every 2 seconds while it was out, in addition to increasing its auto attack damage. Both the pulsing AoE damage and the auto attack damage increase would be based on the item level of the Azerite piece, as well as just additional stackings of the trait. The Earth Elemental is a 5-minute cooldown ability which summons an Earth Elemental Guardian for 1 minute, which you can vaguely control, and has a taunt ability which doesn't work on raid bosses. The biggest use of the Earth Elemental is to bring it out as an emergency tank, because its damage is not suited for DPS. So, the trait was obviously trying to turn the cooldown into a much better DPS cooldown. However, it was horribly undertuned, so if you did bring it out for its damage thanks to this trait, it wasn't going to contribute very much. In patch 8.1, they actually removed the trait and replaced it with Tectonic Thunder, which is an elemental trait that increases the damage of Earthquake, and gives it a 25% chance to make your next Chain Lightning instant cast, which was a lot more useful than Rumbling Tremors, but was also one of the least picked traits for elemental shamans. Even less so than Synapse Shock, which is why it's slightly higher on this list. And you can also see why people complain so much about elemental shamans in BFA for being in a poor state. And at number 1, we have Fit to Burst, a major trait for Brewmaster monks. This trait has the ability where, while you're at heavy stagger and you drink Purifying Brew, your next 3 melee abilities will heal you for a set amount. Brewmasters are the tanking spec of monks, and have a special ability called Stagger, where they delay about 40% of the damage they take over 10 seconds, instead of taking it all at once. So Brewmaster monks are constantly taking damage from their Stagger ability, because it's just delaying the damage, and Purifying Brew is an ability they have, which allows them to clear 50% of that Stagger. And Stagger has certain amounts and thresholds to it to let you know just how much damage you're taking from the current Stagger that's constantly adding up as you take damage in a raid fight, and Heavy Stagger is when the amount to Stagger is 60% or greater than your maximum health. So, in order to activate the trait, you'd need to use your Purifying Brew to clear half of your Stagger while you're at a very high amount of Stagger, and your reward is a little bit of self-healing. Now, in normal raids or dungeons, your healers are going to constantly keep you topped off. Generally, a healer will always throw a heal in the tank every couple of seconds or so they're constantly being healed by all the healers in whatever environment you're in. A Brewmaster monk that clears their heavy Stagger won't really be able to benefit from the minor heal spread out over 3 attacks, as they'll most likely be at full health with that extra amount of Stagger dot gone. However, even under ideal circumstances, where you're constantly using Purifying Brew while you're at heavy Stagger, and not being topped off immediately afterwards, the trait still doesn't provide enough healing to compete with virtually any other available Azerite trait, which is kind of hilarious. Not only is this trait hard to actually use, once you actually get the effect, it's not even that good. At least Moment of Repose provides good healing, and actually scales pretty well as far as Azerite trait stacking goes, which is why Fit to Burst is at number 1 on this list. Most of the mediocre traits were purged in 8.1, but this one managed to stay all the way until the end of the expansion. In this video, we'll go over some of the worst dungeons from World of Warcraft's history. Starting off at number 10, we have a more contentious pick, Halls of Reflection from Wrath of the Lich King. Now, Halls of Reflection is actually a pretty well-loved dungeon. However, only for the last third of the dungeon. The first 2/3 of the dungeon comprises of fighting 8 waves of adds, huddled into a corner because that was the most efficient way to AoE them all down. Basically, once you started the fight, there were a couple of cool RP dialogues, which you had to wait through every time you did the dungeon. Then, once the ghost adds spawned, a couple of them were ranged characters which can't be interrupted. So the best way to AoE them all down was to hide in a little corner which provided line of sight, and force the range adds to run all the way into a neat little pile, so that Wrath players could do what they do best and just AoE down everything. Wrath AoE was something else. Pretty much every single class had some form of really good AoE. It might have been one of the golden ages of AoE. Just one of the golden ages. I think the actual golden age was Cataclysm, but that's besides the point. So after spending more than half the dungeon huddled into a corner AoEing down adds, during waves 5 and 10, a boss would come out, which were both pretty straightforward and didn't require any brain power once you overgeared them. And once you were done with the slog that was killing adds, then you got to the cool part where you got to run away from the Lich King by killing more adds. Thematically, the last third of the dungeon is amazing, and this is what makes it some people's favorite dungeon of all time because of just how great that theme is. But mechanically speaking, you never interact with the Lich King. He's just the enrage timer, and you're just killing adds while you wait for Sylvanas or Jaina to break the ice walls. It's just another wave of adds. We don't actually fight a boss. And you win if you're able to kill the adds quick enough. So even the cool part of the dungeon is just more add killing. Except at least you don't have a corner you can huddle into, so there's a little bit more thought into killing the adds which are coming towards you. Although because of how well loved this dungeon is on a whole, even if it is only for a small part of the dungeon, it's only at the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have the Sunken Temple. Now, just like the Halls of Reflection, the Temple of Vital Hakar actually has a lot of fans. The original version of the dungeon is gigantic. It had 10 bosses, multiple levels, secret rooms, and even a whole second floor which is dedicated to just one boss that you have to unlock by doing a puzzle. Then when it was revamped in Cataclysm, they cut out almost the entire dungeon, and turned it into a really small, simple, 4 main boss regular dungeon, which was obviously meant to be a much bigger place. So the original version of the dungeon has a lot of fond memories attached to it for many people, for probably the first time they ran it. Otherwise, it was incredibly confusing, which made it actually hated amongst a lot of players who don't like that type of dungeon. Especially since getting to the dungeon was akin to going through a maze, and the dungeon itself wasn't much easier to navigate. So if you like exploratory D&D style dungeons, then the Temple of Vital Hakar really fits that niche. But hey, a non-max level dungeon doesn't need to be ran more than once, so it probably works for Sunken Temple. And then the revamped version of it wasn't very well liked because they essentially just removed 2/3 of it and didn't really do much else. So while the original version of the dungeon was only disliked if you had to run it more than once, or for just the players who didn't like being lost all the time, the revamped version isn't liked because they tried to make it too streamlined. It's impossible to get lost in the new one when compared to the older version of itself. Although a lot of people did like how exploratory the dungeon was in its original form, so it only gets a low spot on this list. And at number 8, we have the Temple of Sethralis. This was a dungeon in BFA, which had an entire phase where you're slowly trying to move orbs from one area of the room to the eyeballs at the end of the room so that you can progress to the final boss. However, in order to move the orbs, you need to kill adds to clear a path, but the adds endlessly respawn to the point where they don't grant any experience or completion towards the added bonus in Mythic Plus, and there's a couple of adds in the room who can steal the ball from you and take it back. So it was just a slog of trying to complete this little gimmicky puzzle, which just grinds the dungeon to a halt as you endlessly AoE adds that don't matter. Then when you get to the final boss, you have a healer challenge, where while the rest of the party deals with adds, you have to make sure to heal up the boss if you're the healer, which will end the fight once she's healed up to full health. And generally, healer-centric bosses are pretty fun in raids, speaking as a healer myself, so them attempting this in a dungeon seems like it would have been a pretty decent idea. except for the fact that dungeons only have a single healer. So the entire boss relies on your healer being able to pump out massive HPS, while also keeping the party alive who are constantly taking damage during the burst windows that you're allowed to heal the boss. Usually with other mechanics, you have 3 DPS to share responsibilities as special mechanics. This one is just all on one lone person who's trying to get up as much HPS as possible while also doing their job like normal. And you know what? Not all healers can pump out burst heals. Whenever I had to run this dungeon as my Discipline Priest main, I would always swap over to my lesser used Holy spec, just because it was 10 times easier to heal the final boss as Holy, even though I had no experience with that spec. There's a reason they haven't done healer-only final bosses in future dungeons, as those kind of only work when there's more than one healer. It's a neat idea, but man does it not work out well in Mythic Plus dungeons. And at number 7, we have the Halls of Stone. This was a dungeon from Wrath of the Lich King, which on a whole is a pretty normal dungeon as far as Wrath of the Lich King dungeons go. It only has 4 bosses, it's a pretty small instance, so there's no getting lost, and you can AoE down everything pretty easily. However, one of the bosses, or I guess encounters, called the Tribunal of the Ages, is basically a glorified ad wave fight. You talk to Bran, who will trigger an event where you just fight ads which come to your room eventually, similar to the Halls of Reflection. You DPS waves of ads, and at the end of the wave of ads, you get rewarded with a little bit of RP dialogue and then a chest which gives you some gear. Which all in all isn't that bad, it's just when you want to run through a dungeon quickly, getting completely stonewalled by a fight which has timers on how fast you're allowed to kill things really slows things down, especially since just killing ads for an entire boss fight is kind of boring without anything else going on. And at number 6, we have No Morgan. This is a pretty low level dungeon and is one of the first big exploratory dungeons you can do while leveling up. If you wish to do this in classic versions of the game, as a Horde character, you have to complete a small quest first, which allows you to teleport to the entrance of the dungeon. That way you're not killed by a whole bunch of Alliance mobs on the way there. Although the quest is only available in Orgrimmar and not at the actual teleporter's location. And the quest is also not shareable. So you have to have all of your Horde low-level members run over to Orgrimmar, pick up the 2 quests in sequence, then run back to the teleporter's location on the other side of the world. That way you can then use the teleporter to get into the entrance of No Morgan. There also wasn't really good quests to do inside the dungeon. Some of the progression was locked behind things you had to do out in the open world, and it was too easy to just pull an unkillable amount of ads. If you got too close to some of the ledges, you might pull a pack from a different level. If you had a character with a pet class and you tried to jump down one of the ledges and they forgot to dismiss that pet, then they would pull half the entire dungeon to your location. Seeing as it was a low-level dungeon, most people were not super familiar with their classes yet, and didn't know their pet could not teleport down with them. So it was a very easy and common mistake to make. So basically, the place is just really easy to wipe in, and rewards not being super worth it since it's just for level up gear. And for max level players who did want gear from this place, these concerns weren't really that big of a deal. And at number 5, we have the Escape from Durnhold Keep. This entire dungeon is basically an escort quest, where you go in and free Thrall, then protect him from ads and the occasional boss while he slowly walks to the other side of the map, occasionally stopping, interacting with things, and having some RP dialogue. From a lore point of view, the dungeon is actually excellent. I'm a big fan of the Caverns of Time dungeons because they allow you to see big moments in lore without having to scour the internet for books and sources for what happened. However, they rarely work out well in practice as an actual gameplay element. So while I appreciate them for the lore they provide, the gameplay experience is usually pretty lacking. And at number 4, we have the Violet Hold and the Assault on the Violet Hold. Basically the Wrath and Legion version. The Violet Hold is going into a prison in order to basically have a boss fight gauntlet, where you fight waves of ads in between bosses. Now, the idea behind just fighting a whole bunch of unique bosses sounds pretty good. In a Violet Hold style dungeon, you could basically create whatever bosses you wanted, without having to think about what would fit with whatever instance it's in, and be as creative as you want. Although they don't really do that in the Violet Holds. Most of them are just copy-pasted bosses with nothing super unique about their mechanics. Also, there's just a ton of waiting in between each boss, since you can't actually speed up the portals that spit out ads. And because there's really no way to speed up the dungeon, in Legion when they remade the dungeon, they left it out of the Mythic Plus dungeons, because the way the dungeon works just doesn't lend well to being able to speedily run it. An easy way to fix the dungeon would be to just allow you to spawn the bosses immediately, instead of having to wait for them to allow you to fight them. But I guess that would make the dungeon too fast, which is bad for some reason. And at number 3, we have the Black Morass. Now, the Black Morass is one of the first ever Caverns of Time dungeons, where you go back in time in order to help Medivh open the Dark Portal. Again, from a lore perspective, it's neat to actually see important events happen before your eyes, and they should definitely have more events like the Black Morass in Durnhold Keep, just probably not as dungeons. Because in this one, it's another glorified waiting around fight, which combines the best aspects of the Violet Hold and the Halls of Reflection, where you fight waves of adds but have to wait for those waves of adds, and there's no way to really speed up the process. Also, when you run around, you randomly aggro alligators, which never let your healers drink, since they can't leave combat, which means you can perpetually out of mana. And also, since this was released in the Burning Crusade, in addition to mana just being a much bigger deal back then, you would also get dismounted if you swam even a little bit in the water. And there were a lot of small puddles, so if you were on a small race or just a small mount, you would have to swerve around the puddle so that you wouldn't get dismounted. And at number 2, we have the Oculus. Now, I remember back in Wrath of the Lich King, when they first added the Dungeon Finder, if I was ever randomly given the Oculus, more than half the time the entire group would just disband at the start. You know a dungeon is bad when everybody leaves immediately, which would also happen when I ran Halls of Reflection, funny enough, even though I kind of like that dungeon. Now, the reason people didn't like the Oculus was because of the vehicle mechanics. Wrath of the Lich King went hard on vehicle mechanics. It wanted to add them everywhere. And so this dungeon had a final fight, which was entirely done on the back of dragons, where you fly around the sky and fight off a bigger dragon with your little dragons that you're piloting, which have their own little action bars that allow you to heal, DPS, or tank. This idea sounds good in theory, but is kind of meh in practice, especially since the dungeon really wanted to give you a reason to use those dragons outside the final fight. So you had to fly around each of the platforms in order to kill the required amount of adds in order to unlock the final fight. Technically, nothing in the dungeon was overly difficult, it just took way longer than it needed to with all the flying around and the amount of adds you had to kill. Plus, it's not really fun to use a vehicle in a final boss fight, which artificially makes it something you can't steamroll once you outgear it, before they allowed vehicles to scale with your gear, of course. And at number 1, we have Tol Dagar. This was a dungeon from Battle for Azeroth expansion, which basically had you go into a prison in order to fight some prison employees and occasionally other prisoners. And while orchestrating a prison break seems like a neat idea, the big problem with this dungeon was just the massive amount of bugs it had, which were never really fixed all the way until the end of the expansion. You see, the dungeon had multiple levels, but there wasn't really enough physical room between them. So it was entirely possible and common for some of your AoE abilities to just accidentally pull a group of mobs on a different level, that would then run down and attack you. When they added in corruption at the end of the expansion, one of those corruption abilities summoned a giant laser beam from the sky which would attack everything, and almost certainly pull any mobs that were in its path in the above rooms. During the middle of the expansion, when they had the specific seasonal affixes that spawned one of Ajar's minions, one of the best ways to deal with them was just to constantly push them back, which if done in Tol Dagar, would coincidentally constantly pull a whole bunch of other adds in the other rooms, since in addition to being able to pull adds in floors above you, sometimes you could just pull mobs in other rooms adjacent to you through the walls on the same level. Now, the bosses inside the dungeon were completely fine. All of them were excellent boss fights with no big problems. It was entirely everything else about the dungeon that was a drag. It was probably one of the most avoided dungeons on any Mythic Plus that people would only do begrudgingly if they absolutely had to, and that's about it. World of Warcraft Shadowlands is infamous for many endgame systems, and has seen its fair share of criticism even after its ending. Over the course of this video, we're going to go over some of the worst grinds from Shadowlands, and these grinds can include things from purely cosmetic to your character's direct power. It will also be measured on how long most grinds took, or how annoying they generally were to the community to determine what is truly the worst. And at number 10, we have the Crypt Keeper title. This title was obtained through the achievement, The Accuser Avowed. It was a reward for completing a mix of 3 other achievements in the Revendred Zone, and upon completion, it would bestow the title Crypt Keeper to your character. For the first achievement, Crypt Kicker, you have to open 50 Atonement Crypts within Revendred. In order to farm these crypts, you would need to slay mobs typically with a depraved tag in front of their names. These mobs would have a chance to drop an Atonement Crypt key, which would then open the crypts in the open world. The drop rate of these keys would define how long you'd be stuck on this part of the achievement, as it was around 2 to 4% per depraved mob for every key. However, there was a small event in the area that would spawn in the middle of every hour and came with it a friendly ghost NPC and event their mob. When you would give the ghost 30 infused rubies, a currency obtained from killing rares and looting treasures in Revendreth, and if the ghost happened to be a mob named Gajiji the Tomb Raider, It would give you a buff with an increased chance for depraved mobs to drop more keys. The next achievement is Absolution for All. This achievement asks you to help a total of 100 souls complete a ritual of absolution. Basically, as you farm the depraved mobs from before, you will occasionally see friendly ghost NPCs named Fugitive Soul. If you walk up to one of these souls and interact with them, they will tether your character and follow you around. You can then take these souls to another NPC named the Avowed Ritualist. They usually spawn in groups of 4 and surround gargoyle-like statues in Revendreth, and will have a dialogue option when you have souls with you. Selecting the option will trigger an event as they begin the ritual for the soul you recovered, and hostile mobs will begin to spawn and attack you. The convenient thing is, once the ritual begins, you can leave and you will still receive credit for the achievement, but if you're looking to farm the side reputation for the Avowed, you can stay and help the soul. For the final step, you will need to kill 10 Inquisitor NPCs. In order to access these Inquisitors, you must do a 13-step long quest chain from the Accuser at the Absolution Crypt. Finishing the questline will ask you to kill Inquisitor Treyan, an NPC needed for the achievement. Typically, it is ideal you begin the questline before beginning your farm for the title, as it will make the mobs you already grind eligible to drop Inquisitor Synstones. These Synstones are used to summon the very mobs I need to kill for the achievement, but we can also purchase these Synstones from an NPC named Archivist Fane. For 100 Synstone fragments, the currency obtained from killing a depraved mob, he will offer you a base Inquisitor Synstone. For 250, he will offer you a High Inquisitor Synstone instead. In the case he gives you a Synstone of an Inquisitor you already have, you can delete the item and turn it into a batch of fragments from a new attempt. For the Grand Inquisitors, you require luck from the depraved mobs to give you the Synstone, or collect 10 Grand Inquisitor Synstone fragments, and turn them to the Archivist Fane for their Synstone. This means you will kill at least 20 High Inquisitors total before killing the 2 Grand Inquisitors, leading to about 5,000 Synstone fragments, if you're never able to loot one off the depraved mobs. It may seem like a long grind in writing, but typically this grind can be completed with a group of 5 or solo in about 10 to 12 hours, especially with flying now being introduced since its inception and an entire expansion since. And at number 9, we have Renown farming. From the beginning of Shadowlands, you would be prompted to select a covenant after completing the Maw intro questline. There were 4 covenants in total, each providing an all-class ability depending on which one you selected, such as Fleshcraft for Necrolords, a channeled shield ability. They would also provide an ability special to your class, like the Mind Games ability for Priest if you select the Venthyr as your covenant during Shadowlands. These abilities all had their niche uses, and some were just definitely the better option than the other 3 combined, creating a balancing nightmare for Blizzard. If you had wanted to switch covenants ever prior to patch 9.1.5, you would be embarked on a 2-week-long questline in order to gain the trust of the new covenant. This was an issue at the time because each covenant had their own track of renown. This track would be upgraded twice each week from the launch of Shadowlands to a maximum of 40, until patch 9.1 where it was bumped up to 80. The quests to unlock the track were relatively simple. Farm 1,000 anima and free 10 souls from the Maw/Torghast. However, when switching covenants, all progress you had would not transfer over to your new covenant. You would need to start over and inevitably be behind everyone else because they made the decision not to switch. This obviously brought anger towards the player base at the time, as the Renown track was directly tied to your character's power. Every so often, the Renown track would allow further increases to your Soulbind's pseudo-talent system. Soulbinds were mostly passive talents tied to your power, providing stat buffs or cheat death procs for certain choices made. These problems were further amplified when the track was increased to a total of 80, making it even more difficult to swap when you so desired to do so. This grind wasn't all that consuming if you remained within your covenant through every patch, but with every balance update and changes to the current legendary system at the time, people expressed their frustration in having to literally need a whole other version of their character in order to do content as different as raiding and Mythic Plus dungeons. Thankfully, however, in patch 9.1.5, it was made so you can swap between covenants freely once you hit a Renown 80 with every covenant on at least one character, making this switching process account bound. And at number 8 on this list, we have anima farming. Anima was a resource added in the very beginning of Shadowlands and was used as a universal currency for almost all cosmetic items for every covenant. These cosmetics varied upon many things, like transmog, mounts, and weapon illusions. Upon choosing your covenant, you'll begin to obtain anima from all of Shadowlands zones. This currency can be rewarded through killing rares, looting treasures, doing raids, Mythic Plus, rated and unrated PvP, and world quests. The issue was, for the longest time, anima was given in such scarce amounts. It would take many hours or even days of grinding endlessly to get even close towards the cosmetic you might have sought at the time. This created a very quick decline in motivation for many collectors, as the efforts you gave almost felt hopeless. For perspective, in the beginning of Shadowlands, if you wanted to have every cosmetic armor set for each armor type, that would require 16 very high maintenance characters at max level, grinding daily for your rewards, as you couldn't swap covenants between one character yet. It would specifically need 4 plate wearers, 4 mail, 4 leather, and 4 cloth, one of each covenant across. For the Night Fae plate set for the Renown vendor, not accounting for the grateful offerings of your care and renown, it would be about 25,500 anima in total without a weapon. It ended up creating an incredibly time-costly efforts for high-tier collectors, turning WoW into its own job arguably for some. Even towards the very end of Shadowlands, players continued in collecting items that had existed since the expansion's release, truly defining how lengthy the process could be for the casual player. And at number 7 on this list, we have the Cypher console panel, otherwise known as Pokopog. This system was released in patch 9.2 of Shadowlands and was unlocked after completing chapter 3 of the campaign questline. This console was used to help improve the outdoor experience of Zereth Mortis, meaning that if you were strictly a Raider or Mythic Plus player, you could ignore this system entirely. This system introduced a new currency called Cypher the First Ones, and would be used to upgrade the console. These upgrades would range from more daily and world quests in Zereth Mortis, increasing the speed you obtain the Enlightened Reputation, and by proxy, our second legendary belt item, and equipment item level increase in Zereth Mortis. This currency this system used was typically in pretty low amounts, and even when you would obtain the necessary amounts to upgrade your console, the upgrades themselves were locked behind a time gate. Some research upgrades take as long as 5 days and 18 hours, and are completely required in order to unlock the protoform synthesis, which we'll talk about later. For the casual player, this system can seem like a massive task to undertake, but with the progression it offers and changes throughout its existence, many of the cosmetic achievements tied to its process just required a lot of patience. The system also wasn't account-wide, meaning when you began an alt during the current and wanted some decent catch-up gear or needed to farm the rep for the crafter's marks, an item that turned profession crafted gear into better item level versions of itself, you'd be met with weeks-long grinds. And at number 6, we have Korthia, the new zone added in patch 9.1. With the very first patch of Shadowlands, players would be prompted to journey into the mysterious land of Korthia, a land lost in the in-between, brought to the Maw by the jailer. This zone brought with it a heap of content, including a new progression of mounts, gear, and reputations. The most notable feature of the patch was the long-awaited inclusion of using mounts in the Maw. Now, the reason the grind in the zone was so annoying was a mix of reasons. Some could argue it was the strange nature of the zone and just generally feeling bland to players, or maybe people just wanted the ability to fly and not run. Korthia brought with it many new cosmetics for each individual covenant once again, making farming similar to requiring multiple characters with high maintenance. These cosmetics could be obtained through either purchasing them with Stygia from the Reputation vendor, a currency looted from completing virtually any task in the Maw or Korthia, or through dailies at random. At this point in the expansion, players were already given a mesh of daily activities, or chores to some, so stacking even more tasks on top of it soured the taste in many players pretty quickly. Sometimes in order to farm the new mounts, players would swap all of their characters to a single covenant and send their alts at the farm non-stop with the chance of getting the cosmetic they sought. As an example of this being Fleshwing, a rare that would occasionally spawn required to be a Necrolord in order to loot its egg, which would then turn into a mount. Korthia also introduced the Archivist Codex into the game. This progression system was implemented in order to help alts gear their characters, and once reaching Exalted, could allow main characters to buy sockets for their gear. This reputation could be leveled through obtaining items through many of Korthia's rares and treasures, and turning them into an NPC that would reward the reputation. Unfortunately, the end result of this catch-up mechanism was typically received poorly, as for each character you would need to start the reputation grind all over again, and led players to never even attempt the cycle more than once or twice. And at number 5, we have Torghast. Upon the release of Shadowlands, a new infinite dungeon would be released to players to run. Torghast's purpose on launch and to the end of the expansion was used to obtain currencies to craft your powerful legendary items. These legendary items could change how a class would play almost entirely, and varied extremely from class to class, but were absolutely a requirement for all players in order to play the current content. At first, Torghast was received rather well, as when you run the instance, you scale up a dark tower and kill anything in your way and complete puzzles. As you would do so, your character would receive large buffs and could make you as powerful as raid bosses and one-shotting anything that gets in your path. It goes without saying that players enjoyed feeling overpowered and running over enemies. Torghast came with many layers of difficulty, up to 16 different versions by the end of the expansion, and with each difficulty level, the higher the rewards. In the beginning, if you had managed to die too many times, the Terragru, a boss for even some of the best anima power-ups could not handle, would show up and force you out of the instance. Runs already could range to 30 to 40 minute range, and potential of failing and having to completely restart and lose on your required currencies added an extra anxiety to many players. Now, the problem set show from the start is turning this fun mode into a requirement for everyone. If you wanted to do better DPS, healing, or be a better tank, missing out on your legendary was the easiest way to remove you from groups. This fun activity had turned into a chore and served no real purpose outside of creating your legendaries. In addition, Torghast was originally tied to a weekly lockout and would not allow you to spam run it in the scenario you needed for the multiple legendaries for certain places. In patch 9.1, a new currency was added on top of the already existing Soul Ash called Soul Cinders, requiring players to run it even more. During this patch, a new item called Box of Many Things was added to the game, and upon completing Torghast runs, you would now receive another currency. This currency was used to make your character stronger in a very passive way as you do your Torghast runs, such as always providing your character with stronger anime power options and so on and so forth. Ultimately, they would remove the weekly lockout and add cosmetic awards, such as shoulder transmogs and weapons, and even new modes of Torghast that would award mounts and titles. And at number 4, we have the Venari reputation. As you make your journey through the Shadowlands and progress through the story the first time, you will eventually be prompted to head back into the Maw and meet the broker character Venari. She is the main reputation for the zone, and her purpose is to help your character get around the terrors of the zone without dying. Most of the improvements you would give to your character were purchased with the Stygia currency, and naturally through reaching her high reputations with her. She also provided upgrades for making Torghast runs easier. The main problem with farming her reputation compared to others was the simple fact that in the Maw, a rather large zone, you could not mount. In modern WoW, players had grown so used to their speed and being halted to their 2 legs, shifted the pace at which they had grown accustomed. To grow Venari's reputation, you must complete world quests, kill rares, do dailies, and most importantly, not die. Dying would cause your character to lose half of all of your current Stygia, and dying a second time before recovering the last amount from your body would cause it to be lost for good. There was also a mechanic in the Maw called the Eye of the Jailer. This mechanic made it where the longer you stay in the Maw and continue to earn reputation with Venari, the more the Jailer would take note of your presence, sending in more annoying affixes to try and kill your character as you do your usual activities. Her reputation wasn't exactly required, but when it came to long-term quality of life additions to your character in both the Maw and Torghast, the already required instance run and overall gloomy nature of the Maw added to the negative impact her farm had. Eventually, they'd even add a Paragon reward to her, an End of Exalted goal, that would reward a mount. And at number 3, we have the Protoform Synthesis system. This was added in patch 9.2 of Shadowlands, and with it came the option to craft your own mounts through a profession-like system. The gist of the system was you would use a new crafted material called Genesis Motes, and collect various other materials across both the open world of Zereth Mortis and the current raid, Zeppler of the First Ones. There were multiple versions of the many creatures you would encounter in Zereth Mortis as options to become mounts, and these same creatures would have a chance to drop the lattice you would require to create them. For example, to create one of the frog mounts, you would need to farm the frog mobs for the buffonid lattice. On top of that, there were rare reagents necessary for the recipe that could only drop from very certain instances or NPCs. These could take upwards of weeks to months to obtain, as some were locked behind a boss in the current raid with an already low drop rate, being the tools of incomprehensible experimentation. Depending on your RNG, you could be over with this grind for the mounts relatively quickly, but it also had the addition to craft new battle pets for you. These required glimmers dropped from similar mobs based on the type of pet you wanted. So, Glimmer of Cunning for the spider pets. Once you finally farmed the required materials for this long grind and had unlocked the console through a short quest line to access it, you will still need the recipes for each unlearned mountain pet. These recipes typically were obtained through rares, treasures, the current raid, reputation, and the Cypher the First One's console achievement rewards. For perspective, this system alone required many systems to be completed prior to starting the grind, and would leave completionists stuck on it for months at a time. The Protoform Synthesis would also tie the entire Cataclysm expansion in total mounts at 24 that you could obtain. Coming from just a single patch and bringing with it so much work, I think it merits a spot on this list. And at number 2, we have the Abominable Stitching minigame for the Necrolord Covenant. In Shadowlands, every Covenant had their own minigame that could be unlocked and upgraded over time with the Covenant Sanctum Facilitator. These upgrades would take a heap of your animate Forgotten Souls obtained from the weekly in the Maw. Once unlocked, just outside your Necrolord Sanctum, there would be a new location of NPCs offering weekly quests and profession-style stitching tables to create your own constructs and abominations. These constructs would often need multiple unique crafting materials called malleable flesh, that could be farmed off of any mob in the Shadowlands or by completing the weekly's minigame offered, which rewarded superior parts. The superior parts could only be obtained through the weekly quests, and if you ran out of these parts for the week, you'd have to wait for the next reset. These weeklies were completely random, and had a total of 31 weeklies. Each weekly would change depending on the constructs you had at your disposal, and more would become available with the more you created and upgraded your sanctum. On top of the mini weeklies you would hope appear were customization options for your constructs, using the same materials to create them. 25 of these options were required for a meta achievement relating to this minigame, and upon completion of the meta, you'd receive the Armored Chosen Taurolus mount. The meta achievement asks you to complete all 31 weeklies, obtain the cosmetics for your constructs, create every construct, and contribute 100 anima-bound wraps, an item that can be crafted with a stitchable table to summon Visectus. This Covenant minigame specifically was a much larger grind than the other 3 Covenants, because completing it required lots of RNG in getting the correct weekly and managing extra crafting materials in this process. This isn't to mention that completing it also took the fully upgraded version, similar to the others, requiring a total of 26,000 anima and 141 Forgotten Souls from the Maw. This means before the changes to save as many souls as you want towards the end of the expansion, just getting the Sanctum to where it needed to be could take upwards of 14 weeks when you could only receive 10 souls a week. Even after all this RNG and likely months of grinding, you would have the option to purchase the cosmetics the minigame offered, and if you wished for the armor tint on every armor type, it would total around 176,000 anima and 600 souls, should you start at the same time as your main. Needless to say, it blows all the other Covenant minigames out of the water in terms of work and time synced into for full completion. And at number 1 of the Shadowlands grinds, we have the infamous Veilstrider title, also known as the Back from the Beyond achievement. Blizzard has followed a track record since BFA of adding all expansion meta achievements that goes over all the content the expansion has to offer. These achievements are usually removed by release of the following expansion and become feats of strength that reward a high tier title to the player. Shadowlands was no exception, and included this same formula. With Shadowlands already being an incredibly grindy endgame expansion, the criteria that was required for this meta were high. To start, you would need to complete every Shadowlands raid in full, killing every boss on any difficulty, LFR included. You would then need to complete every single dungeon on Mythic difficulty, and the Mega Dungeon at the time specifically had to be done on its hard mode on Mythic difficulty. Hard mode could be triggered by obtaining a specific necklace with your group. This necklace was purchased from an NPC in the dungeon, and you would then trade this necklace with a different NPC which would give you fake credentials, the neck piece required to start hard mode. You would need a fresh instance, but once completed, you do the dungeons normal with the added mechanics and difficulty. When it came to Covenants, you would need to complete each campaign from all 4, raise them all to Renown 80, unlock rank 3 of the Covenant Sanctum options for any Covenant of your choice, and complete the Shadowlands Dilettante achievement. This achievement required you to complete the meta achievement of the Necrolords, defeat the first 8 trials of loyalty for Kyrian, host every guest available to you in the Ember Court for Venthyr, and earn the exalted status with Mary Mosmus from the Night Fae. Each of these grinds had their own gimmicks and styles, and talking about them would be an entire video on its own, but the process regardless was time consuming and required alts oftentimes. After this, you would need to complete the campaign storylines of both Match 9.1 and 9.2, complete all of the Maw achievements listed in Walking in Mawfis, complete 4 out of 9 Covenant Assault Quest achievements, and finally complete all of the Zereth Mortis achievements from A to Zereth. The Maw achievements ask you to unlock at least 5 of Venari's open world upgrades, kill all rare and rare bosses in the Maw, complete every special encounter of the Maw, do all 4 of the hunt types, earn Exalted with Venari, free 200 souls, and fully explore the Maw. Just to put into scale, this is only about slightly over half of the criteria necessary for completing the meta achievement, and we haven't even begun to go full in depth of the achievements necessary within Torghast and Zereth Mortis. Thankfully, for some players who either didn't have time or forgot certain achievements for the meta, the first few weeks of the Dragonfly expansion, this achievement was actually bugged, allowing players to continue farming for the title with much better upgrades and gear, and overall being a higher level. Overall, even by patch 9.2.5 of Shadowlands, the Veilstrider achievement could take even the most hardcore players months upon months of farming to receive this feat of strength. Ever since the introduction of Mythic Plus and Legion, Blizzard has increased its difficulty with a system called affixes. These affixes are constant passive throughout the entire dungeon that all have different effects on a weekly rotation. In this video, we're going to be going over the worst Mythic Plus affixes to have ever existed in WoW. Starting us off at number 10, we have the Tyrannical affix. Tyrannical is super simple, and in modern WoW, it will give all the bosses of a dungeon 30% more HP, on top of an already scaling keystone level. Additionally, the bosses will do an extra 15% damage flat out. It is applied to every single keystone, no matter the level, and only changes depending on the week. Its counter being Fortified, which has the opposite effects, and instead buffs the trash mobs of the entire instance. However, Tyrannical has a higher count for messing up keys, because when you start to reach the higher levels, if you wipe even once or twice on a Tyrannical boss, it may cost you the entire key, and you will not be able to time it. This is because the boss fights are just so much longer than usual, and you can get a boss nearly dead in wipe, losing possibly 4 or more minutes on that key. It's a lot easier to pull trash and make mistakes because you can just resurrect at any point and pick up where you left off. But with bosses, this ability is removed entirely. If you're locked in combat with a boss, you have to defeat it or wipe in order to bring back your party members. Most Mythic Plus routes also adjust Bloodlust timings around the boss, So if you were to pull a boss and use less, you'd incur the 10-minute cooldown regardless if the boss died or not. Because of this, wiping is just much more punishing than with the typical wipes, as Bloodlust is one of the strongest cooldowns in a coordinated mythic group. It also depends on the type of dungeon you're doing as well. In a dungeon, like Halls of Infusion Tyrannical, you could be fighting the Primal Tsunami boss for almost literally 10 minutes, depending on how high your keystone is. The mechanic of it lifting you, throwing you up into the back of the room, and forcing you to run a gauntlet wastes so much time, whereas other bosses may just be a standing and hitting simulator. This isn't to say that standing and hitting bosses can't be hard either. The Soulbound Goliath from the Waycrest Manor has a ramping damage mechanic in the form of Soul Harvest. This mechanic is insanely risky to allow at high stacks, as it may just flat out one-shot your tank from the melee hit to the boss on Tyrannical weeks. But also, if you choose to burn the boss to remove its stacks, the following AoE cast it creates also is just absolutely going to shred your group if you aren't careful. Generally, very few people actually enjoy the addition of Tyrannical, whereas Fortified allows for players to do some crazy AoE pulls and just do massive amounts of damage. Tyrannical definitely slows down keys, and when the goal is to go as fast as you possibly can, the idea that a single wipe can ruin your entire run is generally pretty annoying to deal with. Couple this with the fact that some classes are just weaker than others, such as Hunters, and if they get a target with a certain mechanic from a boss, they may just flat out die on the spot without external help. What's actually crazier is the current version of Tyrannical is a slightly nerfed version of its original rendition in Legion. Back in Legion, it used to increase bosses' HP by 40% rather than 30%, simply meaning every single boss you're fighting now would have had another 10% health to deal with if this nerf was never made. Generally, no one really enjoys feeling like their keys are just going to come to a grinding halt, and don't enjoy fighting a boss for an extended period of time. But because this fix is literally around 50% of the time, it's just something players have to deal with, and it only finds itself at number 10 to start. And at number 9, we have Necrotic. What Necrotic does is every time a mob in the keystone would melee you, it would apply a stacking debuff. This debuff would deal a moderate amount of damage over time to its target, and also reduce their healing received. This fix is solely designed around just completely ruining a tank's day, with the exception of mobs that fixate and cannot be taunted, thus applying the debuff to non-tanks, since the debuff is only applied on melee hits. It's safe to assume only your tank should be getting the debuff in the process. Upon its inception, the debuff would deal plague damage, thus ignoring armor, because it was magic damage. Additionally, for every stack, it reduced healing by 3%. So at around 30 melee hits on your tank, they would have 90% reduced healing. In order to counter this affix, tanks would be forced to run in groups, build as much aggro as possible, and when the stacks in Necrotic began to become lethal, they would need to run away and kite the pack to allow the stacks to reset, all while taking damage from the dot itself. It was an incredibly boring way to tank, as most tank players want to be in the pack and contributing, not running away, cowering, and barely being able to survive. This was especially frustrating to deal with for classes such as Blood Death Knights, which completely rely on their healing for Deathstrike in order to actually stay alive and tank. With the debuff just naturally nerfing their classes for performing their role, it was a pretty big upset. Death Knights are also one of the slower classes compared to the other tanks, so even when they make the attempt to kite the mobs to drop their stacks, they might just die in the process, if they didn't get the talent Grip of the Dead. It was actually very common to see tank players roll to Dwarf or Dark Iron Dwarf to receive their racial ability Stoneform and Fireblood. These were the only dispels in the entire game that were capable of removing the Necrotic debuff, so if a tank got super high stacks, they could use their racial to just flat out remove all of them and not need to kite at all. Following patch 7.2 of Legion would begin a lengthy process of Blizzard attempting to balance this affix to be more enjoyable and counterable for the tank players involved, starting with allowing the stacks to drop off when exiting combat and reduce its duration to 9 seconds instead of 10. The release of BFA would change the healing reduction to 2% instead of 3% per stack, just flat out letting the tank survive more and allow higher stacks. In patch 8.1, the debuff was changed to now apply a physical damage debuff, allowing the armor of the tanks to be more useful and take more of the damage passively. Patch 9.1 of Shadowlands made it where trash mobs now apply necrotic stacks half as frequently, meaning every other hit of the mob will apply the debuff rather than every single hit. So for about 2 whole expansions, it existed in a state where every melee would apply the stacks and just ruin a tank's morale at the start of a pull. Bosses, however, would continue to apply the debuff at the same rate. Bosses were generally never a big issue. However, for many cases with this affix, unless they summoned waves of adds that would melee the tank, as bosses don't swing very often at the tank themselves, and there are breaks where the boss must complete their own various mechanics, allowing the debuff to drop off. Patch 9.1.5 lowers the debuff duration to 6 seconds from 9, and patch 9.2 lowered it from 5 to 6. You can see that Blizzard was attempting to have possible ways tanks could just drop the debuff, while they were still fighting a pack without the need to kite. Even if that wasn't possible though, you could kite the trash packs and let the stocks drop off, and then get back to tanking much quicker with the debuff reduction. Finally, at the release of Dragonflight, this affix was removed altogether, as Blizzard realized there was no world where kiting mobs and trying to fight a healing debuff on tanks that existed so passively was super unfun. Necrotic never really changed how a key was run, other than just slowing it down by ruining the tank's fun, so it finds itself at number 9 and not any higher, mostly for just being a big you suck button for tanks and tanks alone. And at number 8 we have Inspiring, added at the beginning of Shadowlands. What this affix did was it would have a fixed set of mobs in every dungeon that would have the Inspiring effect applied to them. What this did was allow all mobs surrounding the Inspired one to be completely immune to any form of crowd control or interrupts. The mob giving off the Inspired buff itself can, however, be controlled still. Basically, you could pull a pack, and if there was an Inspired mob, nothing could be slowed down, and you either needed to nuke the Inspired mob down as fast as you possibly can, or hard CC it and pull the pack away from it. Things like a demon hunter's in prison, a hunter's freezing trap, or a mind control from a priest were optimal ways to avoid this affix's side effects. If you didn't have any sort of option to handle the Inspiring mob, you were likely in for a really rough time, as not being able to stop important casts with a crowd control was a very detrimental thing to your group. There was also the complication that things like the previously mentioned in prison only work on certain mob types. For the time it existed in Shadowlands, a very large majority of mobs were undead, meaning there were very few ways to actually hard CC the mob before engaging. While it may have given hunters an excellent utility mythic plus, it's never fun to make a class just flat out required to enter a dungeon and have a hope of timing it. As opposed to Necrotic, this affix would affect an entire group's method of play, and change the route so you could altogether just avoid mobs with Inspiring when possible. Where this affix really shows was with pug groups, however, as you'd almost always have that one guy just face pull the Inspiring mob and ruin your chances of CCing it early, and possibly causing it to wipe your group. Plus, you might not even have a class able to handle the CC altogether. So generally, it was just unfun to literally have to just watch the spells you're supposed to counter go off. But Blizzard seemed to take this criticism seriously, as the affix was completely removed from the game at the start of Dragonflight, lasting only one expansion, without attempts to balance it or make it more enjoyable. And at number 7, we have Quaking. Added in Legion with Mythic Plus itself Quaking was a mechanic that would occasionally trigger a brownish circle to form under the feet of every player currently alive in the dungeon. When the debuff of the circle ends, anyone who was standing in your circle will take a high amount of damage that scales depending on your keystone level. Additionally, it will interrupt any spell casting if anyone is hit. The interrupt effect would still occur, however, if you were casting and didn't hit anyone with your circle. So when the Quaking cast starts, you'd need to finish your current cast or just wait for it to end so you don't risk even further downtime by interrupting yourself. Quaking was generally a spread and watch out mechanic, just making sure your group is paying attention to their general surroundings. Occasionally, this spread to make people not wanting to hit each other could pull extra mobs into your pack, possibly causing some deaths in your group. Next to this, the damage could almost one-shot you if you happen to be hit by 2 players Quaking circles. You could assume you're safe, and then at the last second, a player moves towards you and then hits you with their circle, and you take unaccounted for damage because you were originally safe. The worst part was when bosses had unique mechanics that would grip players together, causing super inconvenient timings where the boss would just pull the group together, and a last second Quaking would go off and kill almost everyone at once. And there was very little counterplay when this occurred, as it was just simply the luck of the draw, often forcing Blizzard to intervene themselves to have Quaking not cast at all during certain bosses' mechanics. This is primarily seen with the final boss of the Nocturne Offensive, when the boss would cast Static Spear, and at its peak it will grip every player, potentially killing them due to Quaking, and not even the mechanic's damage itself. This isn't even to consider the dungeons where space is very cramped. The most recent example of this was Grimroyal Depot when it was made into a Mythic Plus dungeon in Shadowlands Season 4. This space was very minimal, and with the incredibly awkward camera angles, it could be super frustrating trying to see where you and others are to try and avoid hitting each other with Quaking. This effect remained basically the exact same through the mini expansions it existed, dealing some damage to and interrupting you if you were casting during its completion. It wasn't until Dragonflight Season 2 this affix was officially retired by Blizzard, likely to not make a comeback. Overall, not fun, and just a big hindrance to the group with no counterplay, outside of staying away from people trying to help you. Near the midpoint is Explosive at number 6. Explosive was a level 7 affix that would spawn orbs when in combat, depending on how many mobs you were currently fighting. These orbs could not be hit by AoE attacks, so you were required to hard target them and hit them with a light attack to kill them, as they had very little health, but just enough that any normal healer couldn't just hit them for DPS unless they had unusually high DPS. If these orbs failed to be destroyed in time, they would explode, as the affix name suggests, and deal high damage to the group. As mentioned, more of these orbs would spawn depending on your current number of mobs in combat, so fighting more would just cause even more of these orbs to spawn that must be handled to avoid a wipe. To be precise, the orb would deal 40% of your health in a 60-yard radius. So just 2 of these going off is nearly all of your HP. Coupled with the fact that you're actively fighting mobs already, it was probably just going to kill you. You have around 5 to 6 seconds for each orb before they detonate, so it was likely you'd assigned one person to deal with explosives, likely a ranged DPS. Obviously though, not everyone can have this ease of access, and it was super annoying to have to try and tab to click the correct orb in a high density pool, as target macros would not work for you. So once again, some classes were simply better at the affix than others, and it put many people at disadvantage simply for existing as the class. It also generally put a hiccup in players' rotations, as you would need to hard target the orb and hit it with some sort of ability, and not whatever was part of your AoE rotation. Melee were quite good at this, but something like a Demonology Warlock was super frustrating, because they're a ramping class, and telling their horde of demons to swap to a mob with little health would complicate things. This isn't even to account for the fact that if you lose a player to a death, the amount of explosives won't slow down, making it even harder to recover from the loss of more orbs coming around. It was never a key breaker, but it was safe to assume that when explosive was in rotation for the week, you'd grow in annoyance, especially if you run a pug, where DPS players don't like having extra responsibility. So it finds itself at number 6 for just generally being annoying, due to the fact that things could go wrong almost instantly, but also not insanely hard to counter if your group is aware of what is happening. And at number 5, we have the first seasonal affix of Dragonflight, Thundering. Thundering would just flat out give all enemies in the Keystone a 5% more health. When you were in combat, you would periodically be overcharged with the power of the Storm of Razagath. Failure to discharge it would stun you and deal some damage. To put it in simpler terms, every 60 seconds while in combat, every player would receive a mark of lightning or wind. These marks increase your damage by 30% and make you immune to roots and slows for 15 seconds. If the marks expire while another player has the opposite mark as you still, it will do nature damage to you and stun you for 5 seconds. If you run your character through another character with the opposite mark, it will remove yours and your opposing players and avoid the stun. Once marked with the Thundering buff anyways, it was pretty difficult to actually tell who had which mark. Very often, players needed external add-ons like weak ores to tell them which mark they had and how long they had, to maximize the damage increase of the buff. Without the external help, Blizzard was assuming you would just count the seconds of the buff in your head or something, in order to not lose your damage. Any mechanic that forces you to use something external from the game is never a good addition to the game, and without the many add-ons or weak ores, it made handling this affix much more frustrating because of the visual clutter it makes. The difference between the lightning and wind marks was very similar in color, and was pretty faded in opacity, so sometimes you might just accidentally run into the wrong person and think you cleared your debuff, or not be able to find them in time, stunning a quarter of your group. About 2 months into this run, Blizzard made the change that tanks would always get Mark of the Wind, because what would often happen is a tank would go to clear the buff to prevent being stunned, and accidentally hit the entire group with mechanics intended just for the tank to be hit by. With this change, it made timing easier to understand and allowed for groups to know who could safely run to the tank when the mechanic goes off. Now, as seasonal affixes go, this was Blizzard's attempt to create an affix that doesn't change routes drastically. It was just something that could exist throughout dungeons. This was because Blizzard was beginning to experiment with using past expansions dungeons, and they aren't all designed to work with affixes like these in mind. Needless to say, they realized this method isn't going to work for the new strategy Mythic Plus seasons, as seasonal affixes were retired altogether after Thundering. This was because the affix was just an incredibly annoying side job on top of the other various affixes and dungeons mechanics themselves, and without the addition of weak ores, it may have been even worse trying to handle it. Thankfully, if you had a really coordinated group, this affix was almost nothing to you. But the fact that it was just something to almost entirely ignore doesn't favor it at all, so it finds itself in the middle of our list. And at number 4, we have Prideful. This was a seasonal affix of Shadowlands Season 1 and was applied to every keystone at level 10 or higher. What would happen is every 20% of trash that was cleared to the dungeon would spawn a manifestation of Pride ad. This means you have a maximum of 5 throughout your entire run. When the ad spawns, it deals some ramping damage to your group and can be slowly brought down. And when slain, it gives you the Prideful buff. This increases your damage by 30%, movement speed by 60%, and restores 5% mana per second for 60 seconds. Generally, it sounds super fun to toy around with, creating very unique routes to perfectly time the spawn in the Prideful ad to utilize the damage buff. However, Prideful begins to show its cracks in the method of its spawning. If you make even the smallest mistake in the trash percentages as you progress the dungeon, it can very well cost you the key, as the keystones were tuned around the idea of you having this affix to aid you. Your hunter could accidentally pull an extra mob as you plan to have Prideful spawn before Tyrannical Hakar in Mythic 15, and it just demolishes your required damage to bring down such tough foes. It's super frustrating for the tank player involved, as the route they have can be completely hit or miss, and they need to execute it perfectly to have effective usage. On top of this, eventually when you hit much higher keystone levels, this affix was just straight up not worth getting. The ad that would spawn would have about 30% of a boss's health, and it would take far too long to bring down, and you'd likely die from the ramping damage it does. It wasn't unheard of at the time to get the ad to spawn and then just completely ignore it and let it reset, pulling the rest of the dungeon without the aid of the buff. At least with Thundering, you didn't have to actively change things and just got a damage buff for being in combat for an extended period. It wasn't impossible to recover from a bad pull of a percent if you were hyper aware of how much each mob was worth, but that gets to a very high skill level and memory that not every player is going to obtain. Basically, if your group understood your route and played it perfectly, Prideful could be super fun, but even the smallest mistake was punishing, primarily in pug groups. So it gets placed at number 4, running up a bronze medal for our next entry. And at number 3, we have an actually deadly combination of affixes, Teaming and Skittish. To start off, Teaming was a level 4 affix that would spawn additional trash mobs throughout the entirety of a dungeon. Additionally, the percentage required to complete the dungeon is increased to accommodate for the extra mobs taking place. The Teaming affix would spawn extra mobs in already dangerous packs, usually duplicates of ones already there, and sometimes completely new trash packs altogether. This is already pretty problematic, as Modern Mythic Plus is entirely built around a person's cooldowns and knowing how much is safe and unsafe to pull. When you add extra mobs, it really delays the time to get to the next pack and makes you overcommit resources when you normally would not have. Skittish, however, was a level 7 affix that when combined with Teaming, it would simply cause the threat generated by tanks to be far less than it normally is, and risk DPS players taking aggro and killing themselves from playing too well. To be specific, a tank would be generating 80% less aggro than normally are, meaning your groups would either have to just sit and wait for the tank to build aggro before everyone else is allowed to engage, or stop their DPS mid-pull. This was nerfed somewhat, making the threat reduction 75% instead of 80% in patch 7.2 of Legion. But regardless, you have to be extra careful. Now, in an environment where you need to be going fast and the game is literally just telling you to stop what you're doing to not get you killed, literally no party involved in that is having fun. It made having hunters and rogues better those weeks with the addition of misdirection and tricks of the trade on the tanks. But having to manage aggro is literally never a fun task. It's why repeatedly when classes are doing too much damage or a tank too little, Blizzard will intervene and buff the threat generation of their classes dramatically. Having to tell your DPS to hold their cooldowns for the sake of their tank and their very lives could be an entry on its own. But when you realize these two affixes were able to be together, you may have just skipped doing dungeons altogether then. Basically, not only are you trying to hold off your damage to be as careful as possible, you also are going to be doing so upwards to 2 times as frequently because of the additional mobs taking place in the dungeon due to teaming. It brought dungeons to an absolute stall. And it's crazy to think they both existed in the game for so long, as they were both fully retired at the start of Shadowlands. This isn't to mention that healers also build aggro from using healing spells on injured allies. It wasn't uncommon for a healer to heal the tank attempting to build threat in the Skittish pack and just altogether steal aggro from them and get killed in the process. These two alone may deserve their own entry, but they absolutely ruin the enjoyment of keystones during their existence, because stopping and waiting in a timed event is never an ask for any level of player. Our second to last entry in this list is Bolstering, added in Legion. During the start of this affix, when any trash mobs were to be killed, it would empower any nearby enemies you were currently in combat with. This would increase their health and damage by 20%, stacking up to 31 if you ever actually managed to get that high before dying. These stacks would not fall off, ever, and would just give the mobs a plain increase to everything they have. To any group, but especially tanks eating the melee attacks of the trash, you could have a mob with too many stacks that just ends up one-shotting you because of how it's scaled. The only actual counterplay to this affix was to kill trash packs evenly so there's no damage buff if they all die at the same time. Regardless though, it made chain pulling much harder to pull off, if not impossible. Chain pulling is the act of pulling a pack, and as it nears death, you grab the next pack to never slow down your damage and just keep going. With bolstering, this risks starting a brand new pack off with the damage and health increase as you engage, because of the last group dying as you did so. It will slow you down a bit, but this isn't what really makes bolstering so frustrating. In patch 9.1.5, they gave bolstering a 20-second cooldown when it was permanent, now allowing especially strong mobs to eventually lose the buff they've gained, a stack at a time. In patch 10.1 of Dragonflight, bolstering was changed to no longer buff the health of trash packs, making it just damage now. The health before this change certainly made packs take longer, just because it was basically healing each mob for 15%, depending on their current HP when you kill things around them. It's especially problematic in high density dungeons such as Freehold or Everbloom, where no matter how careful you are, there are tons of mobs to be pulled per pack, and it will make the last living one do ridiculous damage. No one has fun trying to play the game and then just getting one shot by the last mob of a pack in a scenario where pulling big is the fun portion. If you put this with Fortified during the week, you may as well not even attempt Keystones for the week if you're thinking about pushing them to a higher level. It's genuinely a negative experience for your dungeon group as a whole, and depending on what class your tank is, you may not see them until bolstering is out of rotation again, because charging into a pack and down at the end of it, despite using cooldowns to survive, is a terrible feeling. So it's found as the second worst affix to exist in WoW, which is insane because it is still in rotation. Finishing list off number 1 is Overflowing. This affix was added with the Birth of Mythic Plus in Legion as a level 7 affix. Basically, what it did was any healing you did to your group that was considered an overheal, meaning healing done after they already hit max health, the target who received the heal is instead converted into a heal absorption effect. The healing absorbs are an effect that stack on top of someone's already existing health, and any health given to them, it is first given to the absorb before they are healed for the actual health percentage. So, if you healed someone to full, but overshot a little bit, you would then have a heal and absorb that you have to remove, causing you to heal even more. What makes this affix so bad is that you could remove the heal and absorb and then literally just reapply it again, because you were given the target healing to remove it in the first place. It's almost infinite in duration because of your attempts to actually get rid of the absorb. It was a healer's worst nightmare, and when an affix is made that just completely messes with the healer, it leaves everyone stressed out. The only viable way to play around this affix was to intentionally leave your party members injured, so you wouldn't risk healing them too much and apply the absorb. Imagine being a paladin and using Lay on Hands to save yourself, but now you have a huge healing absorb effect that punishes you for staying alive. You could literally use the defensive to handle the amount of incoming damage from a boss or trash pack, and then make your healer have to heal more because you gave yourself the absorb. This was super bad for Restoration Druids, as their entire kit revolves around HOTS. Once the heal is applied, you can't effectively remove it, really, and it could bring a person to full health and then apply the healing absorption just because they're playing their class optimally. To intentionally leave your group at a hindrance was super risky, as a boss could do their next set of mechanics and get your DPS or even tank killed just because you didn't want to have to deal with reapplying effects of Overflow. It actually was one of the quickest affixes to get removed from the game, not even making it to the final patch of Legion, and getting removed in the Tomb of Sargeras patch 7.2. So, in summary, if you healed, you probably applied the overflow effects accidentally just for healing someone to max, like you're supposed to, and be punished for it, which leads us to be number 1, as, again, no one would or did enjoy this presence. In this video, we'll be going over some features that were in the game that players generally didn't like, and were eventually removed or are still part of the game to this day. And at number 10, we have the mission tables. Ever since Warlords of Draenor, players have had a mission table of some kind, where you send off NPCs for a couple of hours at a time, and then they succeed if they have the correct counters to whatever's predetermined once the mission starts. It was an excellent way to gain currency and items, although it is essentially a Facebook-style game where you just waited, and there wasn't much more to it than collecting and gearing the followers. Originally, when they first introduced it in Warlords of Draenor, they were incredibly well liked, for about a month. Then people grew to hate them, which is made even worse by the fact that they added a second mission table later on in the expansion called the Shipyard, which many considered a straight downgrade to the original, since you'd have to pay a whole bunch of resources for ships that could be destroyed if you failed a mission. The mission tables were also incredibly lucrative, to the point where Warlords of Draenor had the highest gold inflation at any point in the game's history, by just doing your missions and a couple of dailies provided by your garrison. In Legion, they tried very hard to circumvent this. They vastly lowered the amount of followers you could even have, and the amount of missions you could run per day. In BFA, they did the same thing, giving you even less followers with about the same amount of missions. And then in Shadowlands, they still have the system, although instead of having a rock, paper, scissors counter style battle, The followers actually have abilities where they fight and deal damage, and Blizzard put some real effort into trying to improve the mission table over the past 3 expansions. Personally, I'm a fan of the newest iteration of it. It just really needs a balancing tune because my Venthyr followers are incredibly weak. Now, this one is only at number 10 because it is a system that a lot of people don't like, but also it's so minor that you can basically just ignore it and it doesn't really affect you very much. Ever since they removed the ability to gain raid level gear from the table after Warlords of Draenor. And at number 9, we have weapon skills. This was a thing in the game for quite a while that wasn't removed until Cataclysm, I think. Where every time you got a new weapon, you had to make sure you went out and hit something 1,000 times in order to get that skill up so that you could use the weapon properly. And there was also some code in the background which gave you extra hit or expertise depending on how much weapon skill you had, or a lower chance to get glancing blows. Basically, you wanted a high weapon skill because it increased your DPS. But they didn't really have items in the game that increased your weapon skill past the maximum, outside of a few outliers. This is probably where the weapon skill kind of failed. Once you max out your weapon skill, it was a stat you no longer even thought about, which kind of made it redundant if there was almost no way to increase it past the maximum. And it was basically just a chore you had to do on your character once, and then never do it again. In the game files, there's actually a whole bunch of items which had the potential to have an increased weapon skill attribute attached to them as a stat, as well as the famous Edgemaster Handguard item from Vanilla WoW, which despite not being a max level item, were BIS for a lot of classes because of the weapon skill increases it provided. So, they definitely had plans to have more items that gave weapon skills as well, but they just abandoned the idea because weapon skills was kind of a complicated stat. And people weren't really 100% sure exactly how it even worked in Vanilla WoW. And at number 8, we have Pathfinder. Pathfinder is a system where you can't actually fly in the new zone of an expansion until you complete a long achievement, usually involving gaining a whole bunch of reps and completing basically every story quest that expansion has to offer. And it's almost never available at launch, as you first have to wait halfway through the expansion before you can even complete it. When this was first introduced in Warlords of Draenor, it got a pretty lukewarm response. A lot of people just wanted to be able to pay to fly, and a lot of other people were completely fine getting it for free by just playing the expansion like normal. So it wasn't universally hated. Then they did the same thing in Legion and BFA, and it got the same response in both of those expansions. Pretty lukewarm. People were kind of expecting it at that point. However, once we got to BFA, the problems with Pathfinder started to become more apparent. If you did not play during Legion or Warlords of Draenor, and came back to the game in BFA, then you had to do a whole bunch of grinding in old content, just so that you could fly on mounts with your alts in those past zones. And that's quite the investment to traverse old zones a little bit more conveniently while leveling alts. Which is to say, it's not really worth the time or effort required. A lot of returning players just straight up never unlocked flying in old zones, because it required way too much time for how little of a reward it was, to the point where it basically just punished people who didn't play in those expansions. For players like me, who unlocked them normally while playing through all those expansions, I never really minded it very much. However, if I made a new account and had to do all those grinds fresh right now, I would definitely hate the feature as well. Although Blizzard did eventually fix this, with Shadowlands they straight up just removed the requirement of Pathfinder for some of the past expansions, only requiring you to get Pathfinder for the current expansion in order to fly in that current expansion, and then after the expansion is over, they'll probably make it so you can fly no problem. Although it's only kind of fixed. You do still need to get Pathfinder for BFA, but I assume eventually they'll grant flying for that expansion to everyone as well. And at number 7, we have the PvP stat templates. In World of Warcraft PvP, over the years there used to be different kinds of gear that would only affect PvP related stats, and that was kind of how they tried to balance gear in PvP. Since PvP in World of Warcraft is kind of inherently unbalanced, because of how much power gear will give your character. And most other competitive PvP games have a baseline that everyone starts with at the beginning of the match, and it's generally seen as unfair to gain a whole bunch of advantages outside of that current match. But since World of Warcraft PvP takes place in an MMO, it also made sense for that gear that you acquired in other parts of the game to also help you out in just one other part of the game. So, in an effort to try to make PvP in an MMO more balanced, they introduced the PvP stat templates, which basically just ignored your gear and gave you stats based on what Blizzard decided your class probably needed. So you could no longer bring in overpowered trinkets or items with bonuses, and your character can go into an arena or battleground match as basically a vanilla version of itself that could only use things based on your class and PvP talents. And having a higher item level would just increase the amount of your stat template by something like 1% per 10 item levels. So you couldn't really control your gear in PvP. And this did kind of make things a lot more balanced. Blizzard could just adjust and fix PvP problems by just adjusting the stat template. That's exactly what they did in Legion during the one expansion that had stat templates. Except there was a few problems to this more fair system of WoW PvP. And pretty much everyone hated it. For one reason or another, no one really liked this change, even though it did, on paper, make things a lot more balanced. Turns out, people like to use their gear in special items in PvP. And some people like the inherent advantage min-maxing their gear outside of PvP could provide. But one of the biggest problems was you could still increase your stat template by getting better gear. So it basically forced PvP players to have to do a whole bunch of PvE content in order to increase their stat template, since they no longer had PvP vendors in order to buy gear from that. So it wasn't really that balanced, since you could majorly influence the baseline stat anyway, and since the PvP stat template was so universally hated, they eventually just removed it in the next expansion and tried something else that people didn't like. And at number 6, we have personal loot, or more specifically, the removal of master loot and the need/greed. When Blizzard added personal loot to the game, the system which is currently active as of Shadowlands, the expansion I'm making this video in, when you kill a boss in a dungeon or raid, the game will automatically distribute loot from those bosses to everyone in the raid, depending on who actually won the role internally, and then it will give you a piece of loot that's useful for your class. In theory, this is totally fine. It's an excellent tool for pug groups, as you no longer have to worry about the raid leader ninja looting pieces of gear, or some really sought-after mount. And to make it even more pug-friendly, they made it so you can't even trade an item you get through personal loot, unless you've already had a piece of equipment in that slot of a higher item level. And since you can no longer even have the option to master loot, you don't have to worry about a pug group swapping to master loot right before an important boss, or being forced to run in a group where they only have master loot, or be in a situation where master loot is the preferred thing for pugs so no one uses personal loot. They got rid of all of that by just removing the choice. This is actually a big win for pugs, but not so much for everyone else. This system has single-handedly caused World First races to become almost completely pay to win, as top raids have to spend millions of gold in order to circumvent the personal loot system, so they can funnel gear to their raid starting lineup through split heroic runs. And if your guild doesn't have hundreds of millions of gold in order to pay for a whole bunch of BOEs, and a person whose only job is to go out and buy BOEs for everyone, then you can't really compete in a World First race since there's plenty of guilds who are willing to put in that amount of gold for the advantage it provides. As someone who primarily pugs or runs with a pretty casual guild, it doesn't really affect me very much, and is kind of a huge problem only for top-end raiders, which is why it's somewhat low on this list. Statistics show that less than 1% of players even clear the hardest level mythic boss of the current raid tier. It should also be worth mentioning that in a recent interview, the GM of Limit, a top raiding guild with a few World First wins under their belt, stated that if Master Loot was added back to the game, it would only make things harder on them, since they'd run even crazier split runs to make sure everyone had the best possible gear before the Mythic week started. So it turns out the problem is not as simple as just adding Master Loot back to the game, because World First Raiders are going to be doing their thing no matter what. And at number 5, we have Titan Forging. This was a system which first made its way to the game all the way back in Mists of Pandaria, with the Warforged system, which basically gave all gear a chance to have a higher item level. Now at first glance, this didn't really seem that bad. It meant every time you did a raid, dungeon, or anything that dropped gear, there was a chance you can get a legitimate upgrade to your equipment. And it incentivized people to want to run lower difficulties of instances, because there was always that chance they could get an upgrade, so it could be worth their time. However, there was a big problem with it, and that it wasn't really made apparent until it was out in the game for a while. Where if there's always a chance that your gear can Titan Forge to be better, then if you ever get a normal vanilla piece of gear, then you're just kind of disappointed that it wasn't Titan Forged. And it would also incentivize people to just constantly run instances of all their difficulties to try to get a full set of Titan Forged gear, which was such a low chance that it was basically impossible. There was no real way to get your best possible set of equipment, because it was almost impossible to get all of your best set of equipment Titan Forged. Although it did also give incentives for high-geared players to run low content, so Blizzard saw it as kind of success for the longest time and was very resistant to actually remove it from the game. And casual players weren't running dungeons over and over anyway, so they were happy to get lucky and sometimes get incredibly high item level pieces of gear from doing their normal raids or something. Although eventually Blizzard relented, and agreed that it probably wasn't that fun for competitive players not ever being satisfied with their gear, because it wasn't all Titanforge, and that it was impossible to do that in the first place. So they just eventually removed it from the game at the end of Battle for Azeroth. And at number 4, we have Warfronts. This was a new system added to the game in Battle for Azeroth, which was supposed to be like a Warcraft 3 style game that everyone participated in, where in a large group you go around and collect resources in order to build buildings and units, in order to eventually take on the enemy keep and defeat their general. And on paper that sounded like it was a lot of fun. However, when we finally got the feature, it turns out the mode was so easy that it was almost impossible to lose. Without any kind of urgency or need to coordinate, most people would just do Warfronts and AFK in the center before eventually they just won. Now, it was possible to lose. It was just incredibly difficult to lose. The Warfront also gave really good rewards for completing them, so a lot of people did them anyway, and thought if they're so easy, might as well try to complete them as fast as possible. Except the Warfronts were also time-gated while inside of them. They were just things that required arbitrary timers that you could not speed up, no matter what you did. So you spend a lot of time just waiting around for those timers to eventually allow you to defeat the enemy general. For something that was supposed to be a selling point of the expansion, they only ever released 2 of them, and neither of them were very well liked. So they kind of scrapped it very early on, and did try to add a heroic version of the 2 that they did put in the game. And the heroic versions were a huge improvement over the unlosable normal ones. Although at that point of the game, everyone had already written them off as a lost system, including Blizzard, so people rarely did Warfronts outside of one weekly quest for the heroic version. The Warfronts were an excellent example that players don't like content that is too easy. They at least need to pretend that there's some semblance of difficulty going on. Even LFR is more difficult than whatever Warfronts could possibly accomplish in their normal versions. And at number 3, we have another BFA feature, the Island Expeditions. Just like Warfronts, this was another key feature of the expansion, sold to players as a thing, where you go around to different unexplored islands, and you'd run around and be able to explore a whole bunch of hidden treasures, secret entrances, with items and mounts. It sounded like a pretty fun feature. And also you can get some Azerite power to upgrade your character's power in the process. So it seemed like a win-win. You could explore and get a whole bunch of cosmetics, while also directly increasing the power level of your character. But in order to not make Island Expeditions so easy, they added an inherent timer, where you had to race against an enemy faction who was also exploring the island at the same time. And whoever got their Azerite progress bar filled up first was the winner. Now here's the thing with this feature. Island Expeditions became the best way to grind out artifact power. So top players who needed to grind out higher neck levels would do Island Expeditions non-stop all the time in order to get the tiniest amount of an advantage, or to just unlock the pieces of equipment they would get from raids. And the other downside was, since you were on a time limit, you had to complete it before the enemy team did. You were actively just disincentivized from exploring, and instead the most efficient way to do Island Expeditions was to just run in and group as many mobs as possible and AoE them down. And doing anything else was kind of redundant. So Island Expeditions basically turned into giant ad pools, where you would just do nothing but fight ads the entire time. But at least you could do them somewhat quickly, unlike Warfronts. And there was a higher possibility that you could lose, unlike Warfronts. Although just fighting an endless wave of minions over and over, since you were incentivized to do Island Expeditions non-stop, made the feature hated very quickly. If you did actually try to take your time and explore, there was a good chance you'd lose that particular run, as the enemy team would get their Azerite up before you. And also, it was just more efficient to kill mobs than looking for little treasures anyway, since all the loot you got at the end of Expedition was random anyway after a certain patch. This is another selling point of the expansion that was kind of abandoned mid-expansion, and they stopped adding new content to the islands towards the end, instead focusing on stuff like Horrific Visions, and probably working on Torghast in the upcoming Shadowlands expansion. And at number 2, we have Legendaries, or Legendaries from Legion. Generally, a lot of things about the Legion expansion were very well loved, except for the PvP stat templates of course, and the mainstay use of Titan Forging, and the first implementation of the Legion Legendaries. In their very first form, a Legendary was a piece of equipment that gave you such an incredible boost to your player's power that you absolutely wanted to get your 2 Legendaries as soon as possible. And more specifically, you wanted to get 2 specific Legendaries that were the best for your class. However, the way to get Legendaries was entirely random. On the first character you had a high chance to get your first 4 legendaries before the game would remove your bad luck protection and then make them a lot harder to obtain randomly. So what you had to do in order to get your best legendary was just hope that one of those first 4 that you could obtain quickly happened to be some of your best. If they were not, then there was nothing else you could do. And mind you, these legendaries were incredibly powerful. Some specs had their whole rotations revolving around certain legendaries, as they could drastically increase your DPS or healing output. And on the other end, some of the legendaries were completely worthless for some classes. So there was a chance that the first 4 legendaries that you got were 4 that just didn't contribute to your character's power at all. It was so bad that some top raiders would simultaneously gear up multiple alts of the same class, just to get a chance at the first 4 legendaries being 2 that were useful for them. And then they would just delete the other classes that didn't get a useful legendary. And since the chance to get legendaries outside of the first 4 was so low, there were some classes who just never got all the legendaries for their class by the end of the expansion, or wouldn't complete it until near the end of the expansion. Now, people did like the idea behind the legendaries themselves. It was fun to have incredibly powerful pieces of equipment that can completely change your rotation. The biggest problem with them was literally just how you obtained them, which was entirely random. There were activities that gave you a higher chance to get legendaries than others, but you could just get a legendary from looting a Blingatron gift package, for example. It wasn't until the end of the expansion that they finally added a vendor for buying specific legendary items. And this was after already progress was done, so it was a completely meaningless gesture. In Shadowlands, they returned the system of legendaries in the same way as Legion, except with 2 differences. One was the individual legendaries are much weaker than the individual legendaries from Legion. And also, they created a crafting system, where you just need to get the legendary's recipe in order to make it. You could also make it for 2 slots instead of being stuck to a single equipment slot. And they made getting the recipe a lot easier, where you could buy some of them reputation from vendors, some of them would drop from specific bosses, but have a guaranteed chance to drop them every time you kill that boss, and some of the more harder ones are just locked behind weekly rotations, where you have a guaranteed chance to get them if it does pop up, or in the twisting corridors. People did like the legendaries, they just didn't like how you obtain them. So with basically the same system and a better way of obtaining legendaries in Shadowlands, that kind of proved the system itself wasn't flawed. It just really needed some work. And before we go on to number 1, I have a couple of honorable mentions. First, we have Horrific Visions, another feature added in BFA at the end of the expansion, where you ran a solo instance on a timer in order to get some great rewards at the end of it. The system itself was actually kind of fine. It didn't start to get terrible and started to run it with 5 masks, and then just some of the terrible affixes those masks would give you, which eventually it did fix halfway through the patch to be 10 times less annoying. And it doesn't really apply in the same tier as a lot of the other features that made this list since they were eventually fixed mid-patch. LFR, the looking for raid model of WoW, which is commonly hailed as a terrible feature for the game, although I just straight up don't agree with the popular opinion on this one, because I've talked to a whole bunch of fans over the years who only get to see current raids through LFR. And it launches so late into a raid tier that you don't need to run it in order to gear up if you do a raid normally, which kind of fixes the problem it used to have where you were incentivized to run LFR in order to get early set bonuses. And ever since they delayed the release of LFR, that hasn't been an issue. And now it's basically a mode for casual players to actually see the story of the raid tier. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to experience it for themselves at all. And finally, Corruptions, a new type of enchantment that had a random chance to proc on pieces of equipment at the end of BFA, which was introduced after they removed Titan Forging. Now, I know Corruptions were very controversial. They caused a whole bunch of problems for balance of the game, but they were always sold as being temporary, and they were kinda supposed to be crazy. And I actually really like them, although probably only because they were temporary. If it was a lasting feature, I don't know if I would have liked them as much as I did. And finally, at number 1, we have Azerite Armor and the Heart of Azeroth. And yes, this is another mainstay feature of BFA. You can kind of see why the expansion had a kind of a bad rap. Now, Azerite Armor was sold as 3 pieces of equipment which had bonuses attached to them that were as strong as some of the Legion legendaries or even artifact traits. Bonuses that were so powerful they would completely change the way you played your class. And you'd be able to unlock more of them as the pieces of equipment leveled up with your necklace, by essentially making it so you would unlock the full potential of your gear through your infinite power grind. And on paper, this didn't sound very good. In order to accomplish this, they had to remove tier set bonuses, which already did something similar but without having to grind out an external power source. And this system was supposed to be a full replacement of Legion legendaries, tier set bonuses, and the artifact weapons. and no one was really excited for it on paper, like they were for Warfronts or even Island Expeditions. Then, when we finally got Azerite armor on the beta, very late into the beta I might add, they were kind of a mess, and no one really liked them. And they were never fixed once the game actually went live. Now, one of the big problems with Azerite armor was the fact that you had to unlock the extra rings by having a higher level for your necklace. So, baseline, you had 3 rings. The first ring was the easiest one to unlock, and also had the main power ability on it, which was the thing that might impact your class. And then you had 2 other rings which would be unlocked based on how high the level of your necklace was. So, once you eventually unlocked all the way to the center, you would get everything on the piece of equipment, and then it would increase the item level of your armor by 5, when it was fully unlocked. The problem was having to do this again when you got an upgrade, and you went into a raid and got a higher item level piece of Azerite armor. There's a good chance you wouldn't be able to use any of the features on it, despite the fact that you would be able to use all the rings on a piece that you had gotten while leveling, which had the exact same abilities in it. It wasn't so much as leveling up a piece of equipment, as it was having to have a high item level necklace so that you could use your equipment. There's a big difference, and people didn't like having to re-grind out pieces of equipment that they'd already used before, just because they got one that was a slightly higher item level. And then there was a problem with the actual traits themselves. They sold the traits as being impactful as legendaries, artifact traits, or tier set bonuses, and this was actually true for some classes. Paladins had an Azerite trait that was so good, called Glimmer, that they gave it to them as a talent in the next expansion. Shadow Priests had 2 traits that were so good they constantly had to nerf them as the expansion went on to be less powerful. But a lot of them were just mediocre. For example, my Discipline Priests literally had no good Azerite traits, to the point where the best ones were always just ones that gave you stats that weren't specific for Disc Priests. Or, funny enough, one of the best traits was actually meant for Shadow Priests, but unintentionally worked for Discipline Priests. You literally had to be in Shadow Spec to even pick the best Disc Priest trait, and then swap back. Like one of the bad Disc main traits, for example, would add a healing component to Pain Suppression, which is a long cooldown ability that reduces the damage of a target by 40%. It's real easy to go an entire fight without using Pain Suppression at all, since it's a cooldown you save for emergencies, for soaking, or for very specific periods of big tank damage that are more predictable. And even when you do use it, a little bit of healing is not even useful for every fight you do. And not even that useful in situations where you do use it, as most of the predictable times you use the ability, the target's at full health anyway. So most of the time, it was useless, and the situations that it could be useful were rare. And this was of the same tier as something like Glimmer, which was so good that it completely changed how Holy Paladins healed, and their entire spec was based around it. The traits were just not balanced at all. This was kind of a thing amongst all classes. Some of them got lucky and had 1 or 2 good traits, but most of them were kind of mediocre and garbage, because the traits would stack with each other. Since it was possible to get a total of 6 major ones across the 3 pieces of equipment, they had to create them in a way where they could reasonably stack with other copies of themselves, which greatly reduced the creativity they could have with those traits, and sometimes it would just be useless, like the Pain Suppression one, which they then went and added the exact same trait as a potency conduit in Shadowlands for some reason. I don't know why they're so obsessed with giving Pain Suppression a heal when literally no one takes it, but that's besides the point. So, to sum it up, a vast majority of traits were mediocre, or just kind of bad. The progression scale of the armor was flawed in theory, as Blizzard completely removed the whole idea of even having to unlock the rings after the first raid tier, and it wasn't a good replacement for even tier set bonuses. So people were really mad they messed up their gear in order to add that system into the game. If there's something WoW players love more than anything else, it's their equipment. So messing it up this badly is why people complain so much about the expansion. And since people hated the progression system, Blizzard had to work very hard in order to introduce the Essence system, which was a lot more like the artifact system in Legion, where you got to choose a whole bunch of different active abilities and a couple of passives that would greatly impact your character. And in my opinion, I think the Essence system was great. And if they had just launched with the Essence system instead of the Azerite armor, there wouldn't be anywhere near as many complaints about the expansion. Well, probably. They did do a good job at fixing a lot of the problems in Shadowlands, which is why it's probably having a much better reception at launch than BFA did. In this video, we'll be going over the worst Covenant abilities for either entire classes or specific specs. But starting off at number 10, we'll have a universal ability and the only general one on the list, and that is Fleshcraft, the Covenant ability granted to all classes who join the Necrolords. This is one of the 4 most common abilities, as of course the rest of these abilities on the list are only used by one class choosing one Covenant, except this one. So, the faults of this ability are as follows. First, the fact it requires a 4-second channel time to cast at full power. Second, it is rather weak, unless you use it near bodies. And lastly, the long cooldown, although its duration is just as long. Now, the ability is fine to an extent, but the fact that it requires corpses means during mini-boss fights, you will not be able to get the extra benefit out of it at all. Next, you also have that long channel time, meaning a lot of the time you don't even want to use it during a raid boss. Really, the only fights I could think of where it might be useful are Shriekwing during the dodging phase, maybe Sun King if you are DPS and there's nothing else to do, Blood Council if you get to your dancing spot early, and that's about it. Basically, this spell is only useful in raids to use just before the pull, leading to more spells classes need to shove into their 10-second pull timer in raids. That or use it mid-fight if there's literally nothing to do, which few fights have times like that. Now, there is some use for it in Mythic Plus dungeons because of the constant corpses, but because of how Mythic Plus is timed, it can be annoying to your group if you're off DPSing the next group, and you're spending 4 seconds sitting basically AFK next to a corpse to get a shield. And in Arena, you can use it to start off a match, although oddly in Raided, only after the gates open up, meaning classes that already have to set up, like Warlocks with dropping their portals, may have a hard time getting everything out before getting bursted down by a couple of rogues. Fleshcraft as a main ability has a fair few things that affect it, ranging from armor to soulbinds, and as the ability granted to all Necrolords of every class, it is very important, so it being even slightly bad is a big deal. And luckily, Blizzard is changing it in the upcoming patch of 9.0.5. First, reducing the channel time to 3 seconds, and also it now gives the full benefit of 40%, instead of needing to consume a corpse to max out the shield up to 50%. It will also give you a 30% damage reduction while channeling it, allowing players to use it as both a shield generator and an active mitigation during a fight where you might be taking a big chunk of damage. Lastly, it now consumes corpses passively instead of on use. Each corpse you walk over reduces its cooldown by 1 second. This also changes some of the soul binds that affected, like Bonesmith and Plague Doctors. This change should hopefully make it much better, and might even make it better than the others, which grant speed boost, a blink, teleport, and extra healing potions. And at number 9, we have Mage Necrolords, all 3 specs. The Necrolord ability for mages is thematically probably one of the coolest abilities, Deathborn. This is a 3-minute cooldown which transforms the mage into a skeleton Maldraxian after a 1.5 second cast, which lasts for 20 seconds. And that is where the cool part ends. All it does is make your basic spells, Frostbolt, Fireball, and Arcane Blast, hit 2 additional targets nearby, and increases your overall spell damage by 10%. Yeah, for such a cool aesthetic and thematic ability, its mechanics are kind of lame, and that is exactly why it's here. The ability does outclass the other ones when it comes to 2 to 3 target scenarios, but only by a small amount. And because of this super specific scenario being the only time it can even compete with the other covenants, it leaves this awesome ability down in the bone dust. Especially since for mages, all 3 Nightface soulbinds are really good, while for Necro, there was only 1 good soulbind. Speaking of soulbinds, there is also a conduit to assist it, giving this spell a baseline duration increase of 6 seconds. Decent, but still not good enough, sadly. In 9.0.5, they're going to be increasing the duration to 25 seconds baseline, as well as increasing the spell power buff to 15%. And this might actually make it decent enough to finally see a good amount of use, especially in the upcoming raid if it has a lot of cleave fights. And at number 8, we have the Necrolord Prot Paladin's Vanquisher's Hammer. Now, this Necrolord ability for Paladins throws a hammer at your target instantly at the cost of 1 holy power, with a 30-second cooldown, dealing shadow damage, and for holding protection, empowering your next Word of Glory to activate a special ability. For Holy, it is somewhat usable, although still worse than the others. It is at least playable since it got buffed at one point. For Retribution, it's just right out the lowest DPS of the 3, but for Protection, it's another story. While it is the biggest single target DPS increase for Prot Paladins, it is extremely hard to use, because it changes how you use your Word of Glory, altering the uptime of your Shield of Righteousness, and putting you over max duration, wasting uptime, making it just feel horrible to play, and alters your tanking play until it just impacts your efficiency. It does get somewhat saved by its conduit, which causes its damage dealt to heal you, and increases its damage done by a baseline of 20%. With 9.0.5, they seemingly want to try and balance it, but the only change coming is it generates 1 holy power instead of spending 1 holy power, which might make it good enough to be used, for holy at least. And at number 7, we move on to the Night Fae ability for Discipline Priests called Fae Guardians, a rather interesting ability. What it does is it calls 3 spirits to help you for 20 seconds on a 1.5 minute cooldown, each doing a different job, commanded by different spells that you cast. And it sounds cool, but in practice, it's just kind of annoying to use. First, the Wrathful Fairies, which is caused by your direct attacks against the target, will restore 0.5% mana or 3 insanity. This one is commanded by your Shadow Word Pain spell. Next, we have the Guardian, which reduces the target's damage taken by 10%, commanded by your Powered Shield ability. And lastly, the Benevolent increases the cooldown recovery of a major ability by 100% following a Shadowmender Flash Heal. This ability in reality being the biggest one of the 3 benefits, allowing a 20-second cooldown reduction on a big ability for any one person you want. That is neat on paper, but as I said in practice, it doesn't really go this way. Because if you want to Power Word Shield one person who needs a 10% damage reduction, but then shield another, that buff will move and then go back to the person you wanted on. You'd have to recast on the original, but Power Word Shield can only be cast on a person once every 6 seconds, so you'd have to wait. And that goes with all of these abilities, especially with Shadow and the Wrathful. Having to apply Shadow Word Pain to everything, then make sure the last target you apply to is the focus target, is extremely frustrating and overall ends up being the only Covenant ability for priests that has no immediate effect. It even makes it difficult for Discipline priests on single target to get any of the buffs at full value, especially with how it doesn't combo at all with Spirit Shell stacking and raid healing. You don't actually want to decrease the cooldown of your Spirit Shell because of how it only decreases the cooldown of that one ability, and it's best used when timed with other cooldowns and specific raid mechanics. While it is still somewhat useful at times for Shadow and Holy Priests, it encourages a bad playstyle of not casting spells and worrying if the buff will move to the wrong target. That just makes it overall a bad choice. The conduit for it does actually save the ability somewhat, leaving behind a copy of themselves working at 60% potency when they are moved to a new target for a baseline of around 4 seconds, creating a sort of playstyle where you want to constantly jump these around if you can. But if you're Disc and you want to increase your raid healing, you're at a huge DPS loss taking this over Mind Games from the Venthyr Covenant. In the patch 9.0.5, they are really doing nothing for this ability's issues that it has with Disc Priests, but they are buffing it by a fair bit, which does make it a lot more useful for the other 2 specs. First, increasing the damage reduction to 15%, and increasing the recovery rate to 150%, and causing the Wrathful to instantly go to the closest nearby target when you cast a spell. No longer sitting idle waiting for you to cast your first Shadow Word Pain. That way, you can start gaining mana or insanity a lot more faster. And at number 6, we have Death's Due, the Death Knight Night Fae ability, or more so, the passive. The ability just upgrades your Death and Decay into Death's Due. What the ability does is the same baseline for all 3 specs, the usual shadow damage to targets in the area, then the modifications it gains over Death and Decay has a special ability per spec. For Frost, it causes your Obliterate to hit additional targets and adds a stack of Death's Due. For Blood Death Knights, it causes their Heart Strike to now hit 3 more targets, increasing it to 5 targets hit, and also applying Death's Due. And for Unholy, it causes your Scourge Strike to hit 4 targets, and applying Death's Due. Death's Due is a special benefit of reducing damage enemies deal to you while in the area by 1%, up to 8% per tick of the damage they take, and also granting strength equal to that. So, while a cool ability that plays more to the Death Knight style of place Death and Decay and stand in it to gain a buff, reminiscent of old Pally's Standing and Consecrate, it sadly is extremely unwieldy and taxing on rotations. And for all the trouble it causes in playstyles, you would think it makes up for it in how good it is, but nope. Because of its hard cap, you barely get any stacks, and in large packs, even possibly drop stacks early, which is especially horrible because the spell is based around an AoE. But if you get too many people in that AoE, it can lead you to being worse off. The conduit for this ain't really good either, only increasing the default damage the ability does, which is not really the big part about it, baseline by 50%. But the base damage is not why you take it, so even with the conduit, it's not good. Although to many DKs, this is a good thing, as I'm sure there's few Death Knights out there who want to run a class of Death and Destruction and also go Night Fae to match. But with the new patch, that might change, as the damage reduction and strength buff is being increased to 2% per stack, although capping at 4 stacks now, meaning the same max amount per enemy, but you need half as many attacks to get there, making it much easier to get and maintain their stacks. And for number 5, we go to Carrion Rogues for Echoing Reprimand. This 45-second ability costs 10 energy, dealing arcane damage, generating 2 combo points, and causes a combo point to be anima charged for 45 seconds. Damaging finishing moves that consume the same number of combo points as the anima charge function as if they consumed 7 combo points. This anima charge puts a special glow on either your second, third, or fourth combo point, and this makes a very weird minigame as part of your DPS that has you generating combo points to try and line up exactly with the glow indicator, and then spending said combo points. A bit of math on the fly and quick reflexes, especially with random procs. There is of course the cool factor of having your DPS rotation become a minigame of getting to a very specific combo point count, and then spending them, which is almost what you do for your normal rotation. But each time you use the ability, it's different, so having a minigame on top of your normal DPS rotation, altering how your usual rotation works, can put a major wrench in your DPS. This ability is even more annoying for the Outlaw class, which is very unpredictable in its combo point generation. Random combo procs end up lowering your DPS instead of increasing it, and because of this, any rogue who takes this usually ends up ignoring the anima power, and simply just using it on cooldown for the damage it deals and the cheap combo points. When your ability's main focus is completely ignored by the players because it's so annoying and unpredictable, you know something is wrong. The conduit for this ability simply increases its damage by 50%, which I guess is good, since the only reason rogues use it is if they want to use it for the damage itself. And at number 4, we have the Demon Hunter Necrolord ability, Fodder to the Flame. What it does is spawns a demon that will attack you, and can only be hurt by you, and if it's not killed within 25 seconds, it will flee, meaning you did nothing but take some damage for nothing. Maybe the only Covenant ability that can make you worse off than before when you cast it. Killing the demon will drop a greater demon soul. Then, when consumed, will increase all damage by 30% and reduces damage taken by 15% for 20 seconds. Throwing a glaive at it does a lot more damage than normal, about 60% of its health, meaning it's not that hard to kill really. However, with a 2-minute cooldown and just adding more annoyances to a fight, it can be frustrating. Although, something to mention, some good, some bad, the body lasts for 2 minutes, meaning you can use it for fleshcraft, and it counts as a powerful enemy, meaning the shield will be 50% instead of the usual 20%. But there is that while channeling you cannot parry, removing a lot of Vengeance Demon Hunter's defenses, especially since the DPS increase from this does not really matter for them. Also the fact that if you outrange the demon, it will actually evade and run back to wherever it was summoned. So, a cool ability that just really does not play well into the Demon Hunter style. Especially since the conduit to buff this ability only buffs the duration of the damage taken and done effect by baseline 1 second. Now, in the patch, they are reworking the ability to become a passive. Your damaging abilities have a chance to summon a demon again for 25 seconds. You throw your glaive and it now instantly kills it. The demon's death causes an explosion that deals damage to nearby enemies, and heals you for 30% of your maximum health. The explosion does have a soft cap of 5 targets though, dealing reduced damage after 5 hits. This rework might actually make the ability a really strong choice in cleave fights, as constant procs of this in a fight that has constant ad spawns, or even Mythic Plus, makes this way stronger of an ability. The only thing being, Demon Hunters gotta be ready to throw their glaive, as Blizzard has made it so you can't macro these demons. No way to choose this mechanic. So we'll see if the conduit also gets changed to something more useful later. Now for number 3, maybe the only Covenant class ability that has 2 buttons, which is the Necrolord ability for warriors. Conqueror Banner's first ability is just this cool little thing where it allows you to have a glowing Maldraxxus banner on your back, as just for fun show-off cosmetic ability. So that's cool. Sadly, the actual ability is a little bit too bad to be able to use this fun effect. First, on a 3-minute cooldown, it plants a banner into the ground, giving you and 2 nearby allies 10% crit chance, and 20% extra health for 20 seconds. Then it provides you with an extra 1% crit damage buff for every enemy you kill, or for an amount of rage spent, stacking up to 30%. and lasting for 30 seconds. So, while cool in both theme and in playstyle, it does create issues that makes it much weaker solo than in a party, and also requires your allies to be near you, which makes another issue where the banner stays up for those 20 seconds. So if you and your party are forced to move, then it's wasted. And it can be hard to get your allies into that circle to stay in the circle, meaning if you are a lone tank, you will be unable to buff your ranged DPS, and you can't control who it goes on to, meaning the crit chance and the damage, while insane on a Destro lock, might end up on a random holy priest in leveling greens who thinks healing spells have a travel time. The ability does have a beneficial conduit though, where it instantly grants them 5 glory, as well as increasing your strength by 10% baseline while it's planted. In the upcoming patch 9.0.5, they are reworking the ability. On use, it will grant 400 mastery and a 30% increased movement speed to you and 2 nearby allies. It also prevents the 3 of you from having your speed reduced below 100%. It now also lasts for 15 seconds instead of 20, with a 2-minute cooldown instead of 3, and grants you rage per second while active, completely changing the ability to be almost nothing like its original version. For number 2, we move on to abilities that many would say are probably useless, and in some cases even a DPS loss to press. So with that in mind, we have Flayed Shot, the Venthyr ability for hunters. This attack has a 30-second cooldown and costs 10 focus. If fired at an enemy, it causes them to bleed for 14 seconds, and each time it ticks its damage, it has a 10% chance to grant the hunter's Flayer's Mark, which causes their next kill shot to be free and usable on any target regardless of their current health, basically allowing a hunter to use their execute at any percent. Which sounds decent, but in practice is absolutely horrid damage. First, its actual dot damage that it does is bad. Only a bit higher than a basic ability like Steady Shot, but split over 14 seconds. Second, the fact that it only has a 10% chance to proc each time it deals damage. But wait, it does not deal damage every second. It deals damage every 2 seconds. Per use, you're not even guaranteed to get a free proc of Killshot. Sounds cool in practice, but when it's mathed out, it's actually horrible for hunters in single target DPS for their Covenant abilities. It is, funnily enough, the weakest of them in single target DPS. It does have a conduit to help it though, by increasing the proc chance to 15% and causing your next kill shot to do baseline 5% more damage, but is nowhere near enough to make the spell good. Although the changes coming in the next patch might be good enough. They're going to be increasing the dot duration to 18 seconds, removing the focus cost, and now making it baseline grant your next kill shot a 25% increased damage. This may be enough to make it useful. And at number 1, we have the Warlock spell, Impending Catastrophe. This spell is the Warlock ability granted by the Venthyr Covenant. This ability, after a 2-second cast time with a 1-minute cooldown, fires a cloud of anima at the target, dealing a bit of damage to anything it travels through. Then upon arrival, it explodes, dealing more damage to everything around the target in the form of a dot, while also applying one of 2 Warlock curses. The Curse of Tongues, which reduces cast speed, and Curse of Weakness, which reduces attack speed. These curses will smart cast, meaning it will try to match the curse to the target's type. But we all know many mobs melee and cast spells, and especially players. Do you want it to slow a Ret Pally's heals or his attacks? A player will know, a spell has a hard time knowing, and especially since Warlocks can only cast 1 curse per target. This could remove the curse you already had on them and swapping it to the one that you did not want, like the Warlock's movement speed slow curse, the Curse of Exhaustion. Now, this alone is annoying, but what makes it bad? Well, the fact that this ability is a DPS loss if pressed in single target. It is better to press any other ability than this in a DPS rotation, at least on single target. In AoE situations it has some uses, but overall, it's hilariously horrible. Only Affliction Warlocks get even some use out of it, as it is counted as a dot for them, so they can extend it with Dark Glare and use its proc on Malefic Rupture. This ability also has a conduit that baseline increases its dot duration by 50%, but only on the main target. Do I need to explain how underwhelming that is? In 9.0.5, they are buffing the travel damage by 10%, and the explosion damage by 15%. But even with these buffs, it still won't be worth pressing.